This hearing of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee will come to order. Mr. Secretary, welcome. Pleased to see you before the committee again. It's nice to see the Secretary engage on a regular basis, and we appreciate that. And even though we may not always agree on everything, I appreciate your proactively making yourself available to discuss the budget. It sends an important signal about the value of transparency in our two branches of government working together on behalf of the American people. I'm also pleased to note that after 4 years in which this committee, on a bipartisan basis, greeted the foreign affairs budget proposals with various tones of incredulity, today we have a serious budget proposal that, if enacted, would represent the largest increase to the regular international affairs budget in more than a decade. That's not to say that we will see eye to eye on all the specific components, to be sure, but we're looking forward to a robust and substantive discussion. After a year during which the international community has been shaken to its core by the COVID pandemic, it should be clear to everyone that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure in both public health and in international affairs, and especially where the two intersect. I was pleased to see the administration's recent announcement that we will be leading on the world stage by providing vaccines to countries desperately in need. Although I believe we should prioritize countries who embrace fundamental democratic freedoms and rights. For the international community to work for Americans, for fundamental universal values of human rights, democracy, and equitable prosperity, the United States must invest in and lead international institutions and stand up for international law. We must invest in smart economic development and free and fair trade. We must invest in meeting the challenges of climate change, and we must invest in our diplomacy and development professionals. For when we do not, we find that others with different interests and values have the space to act in ways that threaten to upend the global order and undermine our interests. The administration's proposal to significantly increase the budget for state and USAID and other international programs reflects the investments we need to be successful in furthering our nation's interests and values. And I want to commend you for seeking to rebalance the budget away from overseas contingency operations and to restore base funding. But today's hearing isn't just about numbers, it's about how we invest those numbers. So let me take a few minutes to highlight a few issues and areas of concern. Broadly in the Middle East, we need to rebalance a heavily military and arms sales-oriented policy to one that focuses more on strategic, diplomatic, and development investments. And while not directly related to the budget, we certainly want to hear about the administration's efforts to reach a comprehensive diplomatic agreement with Iran that goes far beyond the JCPOA. What is the definition of stronger? In Europe, many of us were disappointed by the administration's decision to waive sanctions on Nord Stream 2. As I know that when you leave us today, you're heading to Europe, I look forward to hearing your perspective about how the U.S. can work to assure Ukraine of our commitment to its security. And critically, in advance of President Biden's meeting with Putin, I hope the administration sends a very strong message to Moscow. Putin only understands strength. On Afghanistan, the security situation is increasingly dire, and we have to start thinking about our contingency planning. The committee needs to hear beyond vague promises of commitment to the Afghan people what we are going to do. In Africa, the administration faces a raft of diplomatic challenges. China and Russia continue to act in ways inimical to our interests and those of the majority of the people in Africa.
My apologies.
Tensions between Ethiopia, Egypt, and Sudan over the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam could destabilize the entire Horn of Africa. Al-Shabaab poses a continuing threat, while in Mozambique another robust terrorist threat has emerged. Coups in Mali and Chad have undermined international counterterrorism and development efforts, and Nigeria requires a fundamental rethink of the framework of our overall engagement. In Latin America and the Caribbean, the COVID-19 pandemic is exacerbating social and political pressures with serious implications for regional stability. We are also seeing a fraying of democratic consensus with deeply flawed elections and far too common attacks on the separation of powers, with the potential results of democratic decay all too apparent in the humanitarian crisis in Venezuela or the irregular migration streaming from Central America. I also look forward to hearing what we are doing to get to the bottom of apparent attacks on U.S. personnel and family members that have left many with ongoing and debilitating injuries, and the steps the state is taking to ensure our personnel are protected. Beyond the immediate health impacts of the COVID pandemic, I also look forward to hearing from you how the United States will address secondary impacts of the pandemic, given that 36 countries and 130 million people could now experience famine this year. I'm also eager to understand how the administration plans to address the needs of the 235 million people worldwide that require humanitarian assistance and protection, a near 40% increase over 2020. Across the globe, authoritarian regimes and non-state actors have impeded humanitarian access to devastating effect, and how the administration intends to address the horrific trend of sexual and gender-based violence in Tigray, Ethiopia, Burma, Xinjiang, and elsewhere, where governments use sexual violence as a weapon of war against religious and ethnic minorities. Finally, as the Senate continues with consideration of its China package, including the Strategic Competition Act this committee voted out on a bipartisan basis, I'm interested in your views on how to resource and posture ourselves in the Indo-Pacific and successfully compete with China across all dimensions of power. It's a long list of concerns, Mr. Secretary. You well know that. It's hardly comprehensive even, but that's the world that we have, the challenges that we face as a nation. So we look forward to hearing your thoughts and ideas for how we meet this signal moment in our country and our planet's history, and the role you envision for the Department of State in helping our nation to do so. With that, the distinguished ranking member, Senator Risch.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I join you in the expression of frustration for the tremendous number of issues we have and the minimal time we really have to deal with them here, but it is what it is, and we're just going to have to triage and deal with what's most important. Mr. Secretary, I understand that you're off to the G7 summit immediately after this meeting, and so I'd like to start on a positive note. There's some bright spots in the President's International Affairs budget request. I was pleased with the emphasis on advancing U.S. global health security. Chairman Menendez and I continue to work on legislation to improve pandemic preparedness and response. It is a high priority for myself, and I think I speak for the chairman in saying it's a high priority for him also. It's something that this committee really needs to do in light of the things that have happened over the last year and a half. I look forward to seeing how we can align this effort with the Department of State, which obviously plays and will play a large role as we go forward. But overall, the request is consistent with a troubling pattern where Congress is asked to provide more and more, and the administration does not respond in kind, and we'd like to see that improve. We see this plainly in the partisan American Rescue Plan, which provided $10 billion to help combat the COVID-19 pandemic overseas 3 months ago. And I still don't feel that I have an understanding of how this plan will put those resources to good use on the ground. The President also pledged to share 80 million surplus doses of U.S.-approved COVID-19 vaccines over a month ago, and just last week provided a snapshot of where they will go. But I don't feel I have a comfortable understanding of the information that should be provided with this. I'd really like to see how the administration will ensure that U.S. financial contributions to COVAX, which are important, are not used to purchase and distribute the substandard Chinese vaccines. We've all seen how those have worked out in the field. The President has now asked for a 12% increase in foreign assistance spending for fiscal year 2022. Here again, Congress is asked to provide more money. We need more transparency and more accountability, of course. The challenges we face overseas are immense, but throwing good money at bad problems hasn't solved much in the past and will not solve anything today. Increasing foreign aid absent a clear strategy that emphasizes efficiency, effectiveness, and ultimately self-reliance will not advance U.S. strategic interests. Nor will a budget that proposes to throw hard-earned U.S. taxpayer dollars, or worse, our kids and our grandkids' money at a wholly unaccountable international institutions, including the Green Climate Fund or UN agencies in dire need of reform, like the UN Human Rights Council and, of course, the World Health Organization, which itself admits that reform is needed. I believe that advancing an effective strategy to compete with the People's Republic of China must be the United States' top policy priority. I expect we will hear today about how this budget addresses this strategic imperative, and we need to fortify U.S. engagement in the Indo-Pacific region. The Strategic Competition Act, which recently passed out of this committee on a 21-to-1 vote, provides a roadmap. I had hoped, and I think the chairman had hoped, that we would get a standalone vote on this on the floor when a bill comes out that is as important as that is, deals with the complexity that it did, and comes out in a 21-to-1 vote. It really should get consideration. Instead, of course, it's been placed in the other bill, which obviously is uncertain where that will go. The bill that we had authorizes funds to provide strategic direction for countering Chinese influence. It mandates increases for diplomatic engagement, foreign assistance, and security assistance for Indo-Pacific. Finally, it will help countries better organize infrastructure deals without falling into a Chinese debt trap or compromising their sovereignty. I'm hoping that whatever happens with the large bill, if it does not pass, that we get a vote on our bill, this committee's bill. With regard to the Iran deal, I'm deeply troubled by the direction Iran negotiations are headed. This is no surprise to you, Mr. Secretary, as we have talked about it over and over again. While your negotiators are in touch with the committee, they are, like their predecessors on the original JCPOA, totally unresponsive to congressional objections. These are not consultations, but simply notifications. Not one of the suggestions I've made has been accepted, either in the first JCPOA negotiations or in the ones that are ongoing now. It's clear that it's intended that we, the United States, rejoin the failed nuclear deal unchanged after the Iranian elections. Your promises to lengthen and strengthen them will come later, but the idea of follow-on agreements is unrealistic and, I would argue, delusional. I can't understand why anyone would think that if the Iranians won't agree to the things we want them to agree to up front, why in the world would they agree to it after the fact when they get everything that they've asked for in the negotiations? The Iranians will never agree to return to discussions without the threat of continued sanctions. Additionally, the administration's plan to pursue sanctions relief not consistent with the original nuclear deal are deeply concerning, especially as you consider rolling back terrorism and other sanctions not covered in the original deal. Moving to Israel, I applaud the administration for refusing to bow to progressive demands that we abandon our closest friend and ally as they face down a terrorist organization. This is a matter of Iran-backed terrorism against Israel, a sovereign nation, and that is being done by a designated terrorist organization, Hamas, using its own people as human shields. I'm disappointed that some of my colleagues in Congress would call this enduring partnership into question. At the same time, I'm concerned that the administration is rushing to normalize relations with the Palestinian Authority without gaining elimination of the pay-for-slay program and other Palestinian actions that glorify and actually reward violence and terrorism. On Afghanistan, I have long called for a responsible end to the war, but by doing so in a manner that keeps Americans safe. I believe that what appears to be a rushed and political decision to withdraw without consideration of our counterterrorism priorities will allow Afghanistan to serve as a future platform for terrorist attacks against the United States and our partners. I have concerns that the despicable attack on the girls' school in Kabul is a sign of more to come. I'm also concerned by the President's submission to Putin and abandonment of our European allies by waiving sanctions on Nord Stream 2 AG. You testified in January that Nord Stream 2 is a bad deal, yet this administration is allowing it to be completed. I understand you have some thoughts on that you're going to tell us about today. This is a decision is really an affront to us. I can't understand, I totally do not understand how the President, within very short time after being inaugurated, within hours, put a pen to a piece of paper, shut down the Keystone Pipeline, put Canadians and Americans out of work, and yet we don't have that same enthusiasm to shut down the Nord Stream pipeline. As the President heads to Europe, I hope to see the emergence of a real strategy for dealing with Russia, not just more dialogue. Give Putin an inch, and he will take a mile, and I agree with the chairman wholeheartedly that all he understands is power. Lastly, in regards to the UN this fall, the United States will renegotiate the scales of assessment for UN peacekeeping. Currently, the UN has assessed the United States at a rate of 27.9%. As you know, this is not congruent with U.S. law. No country should pay more than 25%, and in 1994, Congress enacted a bill that imposed a 25% cap. I would hope the administration would follow this law. It remains in effect today, and it must be used as the negotiating position. I look forward to hearing your testimony on these and other items that are of concern to you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Senator Risch. Your full statement will be included in the record, Mr. Secretary, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Chairman Menendez, Ranking Member Risch, all the members of the committee here today very much appreciate this opportunity to talk about the proposed budget and how it will help us achieve our national security priorities and deliver results for the American people, which is our common responsibility and common cause. We see this as a critical moment for the United States and for our global leadership. We face major tests, including stopping COVID-19, rising the challenge of climate change, supporting a global economic recovery that delivers for American workers and their families. We need to revitalize our alliances and partnerships, outcompete China, and defend the international rules-based order against those who seek to undermine it, renew democratic values at home and abroad, and push back against malign activity by our adversaries. In a more competitive world, other countries are making historic investments in their foreign policy toolkit. We need to do the same thing. And that's why in this budget we've requested $58.5 billion for the State Department and USAID for fiscal year 2022. And just to touch on some of the specifics, the budget will strengthen global health. The United States has been a leader in this field for decades in Africa and around the world. We're asking for $10 billion for global health programs, including nearly $1 billion for global health security to help us prevent, prepare for, respond to future global health crises so we can stop outbreaks before they turn into pandemics that put our safety and prosperity in danger. The budget would accelerate the global response to climate change and the climate crisis by providing $2.5 billion for international climate programs, including $1.25 billion to the Green Climate Fund, to help developing countries implement climate adaptation and emissions mitigation programs, which is directly in our interest. We would double down in this budget on the fight for democracy, which, as we all know, is under threat in too many places. People talk about a democratic recession around the world. Our budget request includes $2.8 billion in foreign assistance to advance human rights, to fight corruption, to stem the tide of democratic backsliding, to strengthen and defend democracies. For example, through technical training for elections and support for independent media and civil society. We also request $300 million for the National Endowment for Democracy. The budget would support a comprehensive strategy to address the root causes of irregular migration from Central America. It would invest $861 million in the region as a first step toward a 4-year commitment of $4 billion to help prevent violence, reduce poverty, curtail endemic corruption, and expand jobs and educational opportunities. The budget would reestablish our humanitarian leadership with a request of $10 billion in assistance to support refugees, victims of conflict, other displaced people, and to rebuild the refugee admissions program. The budget would support our partners in the Middle East by fully funding our commitment to key countries, including Israel and Jordan, and by restoring humanitarian assistance to the Palestinian people. It includes a budget request for $3.6 billion to pay our assessed contributions in full to international organizations, initiatives, and peacekeeping efforts, including to restore our annual contributions to the World Health Organization. As China and other countries work hard to bend international organizations to their worldview, we need to do our best to ensure that these organizations instead remain grounded in the values, the principles, the rules of the road that have made our shared progress possible for so many decades. And finally, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member, to deliver in all of these areas, the budget will reinvest in our most vital asset, and that's our people. It will provide new resources to recruit, train, and retain a first-rate, diverse global workforce with nearly 500 additional foreign and civil service positions, the largest increase for the State Department staffing in a decade. And, critically, it would modernize our technology and cybersecurity, protect our embassies and consulates, include a direct appropriation of $320 million for consular services worldwide, so we can continue to provide those vital services to Americans and those who seek to travel, study, or do business with the United States. Our national security depends not only on the strength of our armed forces, but on our ability to conduct effective diplomacy and development. That's how we solve global challenges. That's how we forge cooperation, advance our interests and values, protect our people, and prevent crises overseas from becoming emergencies here at home. And that's why diplomacy and development are smart investments for American taxpayers. A final word, Mr. Chairman. A top priority for me as Secretary is to restore the traditional role of Congress as a partner in our foreign policy making. That's the spirit that I bring to today's conversation, and I'm grateful for this opportunity and the opportunity to have a dialogue and answer your questions. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Mr. Secretary. We look forward to engaging in that. We'll do a start around the questions. And let me first start on the budget. I have been a robust defender of the State Department's budget in years in which we received budgets that clearly could not meet the mission of the State Department or the interests of the United States. So I'm glad to see, as I said in my remarks, a budget that is real and that would be the single most significant increase in a decade. And I support, in general, I support the effort. I may have some suggestions to make as we move forward on the refinement of elements of it, but I do want you to know I support it. Having said that, I'd like to explore with you some regional issues for which this budget is ultimately going to be put to work. Is it fair to say that when we had the JCPOA, Iran continued to pursue ballistic missiles, Iran continued to destabilize the region, Iran continued to be the single most significant sponsor of terrorism in the world?
I think it is fair to say that, Mr. Chairman, although I think, unfortunately, its activities in those areas have only gotten worse.
I agree.
We've been out of the agreement.
It's gotten worse. I agree with you on that. Is it fair to say that when we had the JCPOA, that Iran did not seek to change its ways in these areas and others, or seek to get greater relief from sanctions in order to change their ways on these various issues?
During the time the JCPOA was enforced, to the extent we were a participant in, I think that's a fair assessment.
Yeah.
Yes.
And so here's the concern that I and others have. The Iranians have gotten onto the fact that when they want relief, they accelerate their programs. Now, I wasn't a supporter of the JCPOA. I think everybody knows that. I also wasn't a supporter of President Trump arbitrarily and capriciously leaving the agreement without allies at the end of the day, or a strategy to achieve a goal. And in fact, Iran has advanced its nuclear program since President Trump left the agreement. It has greater capacity. It has enriched more material. And of course, none of its other malign activities have stopped. They've gotten worse. So the question is, if all we return to is a compliance for compliance basis, which is my takeaways from the conversations I've had with your negotiators, and if we have a history that Iran never sought to get more relief in return for dealing with its other malign activities, what's going to make us believe that, in fact, a return to compliance for compliance is going to produce anything stronger than what we had?
Two things, Mr. Chairman. First, compliance for compliance, if we get there, and that remains a big if, which we can come back to, it has to be a first step, not a last step. I agree with that. We have an immediate challenge, which is that, to your point, Iran's nuclear program is galloping forward. It is enriching at higher levels, 20%, even 60% in small cases. It's using more advanced centrifuges. The breakout time that the agreement established, an agreement that on its terms was working, is verified by our intelligence folks as well as the international experts, pushed the breakout time to a year. We're now down, based on published reports, to a few months. If this continues, if they continue to enrich at the levels and in the ways that they're doing, it will get down eventually to a few weeks. So that is a concrete problem. We have an interest in putting that nuclear problem back in the box, because an Iran with a nuclear weapon or with the ability to produce fissile material on very short notice to get one is an Iran that's going to be an even worse actor in terms of its impunity in all of these other areas. Having said that, I agree with you that, again, this would need to be a first step, not a last step, and we would seek to build on it.
What does stronger mean? Your administration, you yourself in testimony before the committee has said, we seek a longer, that I get, and stronger. But what does stronger mean?
So I think we have to look at specific aspects, whether there are areas where we can get even stronger commitments from Iran. But of course, if we do that, we can expect that Iran would ask for things in return. So we'd have to gauge whether whatever improvements might be made in terms of stronger would be worth whatever needed Iran would seek. The longer piece, as you know very well, is important because a number of the provisions in the agreement sunset, although I would point out that the most critical provisions, that is the ability to enrich beyond 3.67%, the ability to have a stockpile of more than 300 kilograms of enriched uranium, these go till 2030. So there is still some time built in if we come back to compliance. But I think we need to look at those.
I hope, Mr. Secretary, that as we are assuaging our European colleagues and cohorts in this effort, that they are truly committed to the stronger part. Because my experience with them is they want to solve the immediate problem, but getting them to follow on the longer term problems is a much more difficult proposition. So let me turn to Russia. I'm sure many other members will ask you this, but I want to give you an opportunity. I think many of us on a bipartisan basis were deeply concerned about the administration's decision to waive sanctions on Nord Stream 2 AG and its CEO last week. As the president heads to his meeting with Putin, I'll reiterate from my perspective, we know what Putin is. As the president himself has said, he's a murderer. He's KGB. And he only understands strength. I would have thought that one of the most significant ways to show strength is to ensure that the pipeline is killed. Now, you all, from your analysis, may come to a different conclusion, and I certainly understand the importance of Germany. But if you want to give somebody a very strong blow to send a message, Nord Stream would have been it. So why don't you share with us the thinking that went behind on the waiver?
Sure, no, and I appreciate that very much. First, as you know, construction on the pipeline began in 2018. By the time we took office, it was over 90% complete, the physical construction of the pipeline. On May 19th, under the PISA legislation, we sanctioned 13 ships and 4 companies, the largest number of entities sanctioned under that legislation since it was put into effect. But we also, to your point, issued a national interest waiver under the law with regard to the parent company, Nord Stream 2 AG, and its CEO. That waiver can be rescinded at any time. Why did we do that? The worst possible outcome from our perspective would be physical construction of the pipeline completed, relationship with Germany poisoned, no incentive for Germany to come to the table to make good on working to mitigate the serious negative consequences of gas flowing through this pipeline. The Germans have now come to the table. We are actively engaged with them. And there are a few things that absolutely would need to happen going forward, as you know, as we've had an opportunity to discuss. Ukraine needs to be made whole if this pipeline is going to go into operation. It will potentially lose transit fees as a result of the pipeline going around Ukraine. That needs to be dealt with. We must make sure that Russia cannot use gas or energy as a coercive tool in its relations with Ukraine or any other state in Europe. There are ways of doing that, making sure that there is backup so that if gas is denied, we can provide it. Other ways of securing and strengthening Ukraine, various snapback mechanisms so that if Russia acts in an inappropriate way, there is some automaticity in the actions that are taken by us and by Germany. So we're engaged with them on that. At the same time, as you know, even when the pipeline is physically complete, for it to go into operation, it still requires insurance, it still requires various permits, and we're looking very carefully at all of that. So what we need to do now is, and it's exactly what we're doing, engage with the Germans to see if we can deal with the negative consequences of this pipeline going into operation. And there's a distinction between the physical completion of the pipeline, which in our judgment we simply could not stop. It was too late to stop the joining of those pipes. Its operation is another matter. What we can do for Ukraine and others is also another matter. Parenthetically, last point, the President spoke to President Zelensky today, invited him to the United States. We're in very active engagement with Ukraine as we go forward on this.
Well, we're happy to see you did that, and we look forward to seeing what you do as it relates to the potential operational capacity if you don't get what you want. And last point, I'd commend your attention to a Washington Post op-ed that we did on Iran and a different pathway forward, a positive different pathway forward. Senator Risch.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I'd like to associate myself with your questions regarding Iran deal. Look, Mr. Secretary, I don't think there's anybody here that would suggest that the dealings you're going to have with Iran aren't tough. They are tough. It's not easy. What is easy is to say no and push your chair away from the table if you can't get them to where you need to be. And the JCPOA didn't come anywhere close on that. One of the biggest problems I had was the tremendous amount of cash that was given to the Iranians. There's no doubt in my mind that part of that cash wound up paying for the munitions that were dropped on Israel in recent days. There's no doubt in my mind that part of that cash was paid to arm the Houthis in order to continue their attacks against Saudi Arabia. There's no doubt in my mind that part of that cash was used to construct and deliver missiles into Lebanon that we all know are there and aimed at Israel. This business of just handing cash over to these people is a bad, bad deal. And I suggested last time that if indeed cash is allowed to flow into Iran, that it be put in some kind of a lockbox or have some kind of oversight over it so that it can't be used for the nefarious purposes that Iran wants to use it for. And I suggested that last time, and I was told, oh, no, they won't agree to that. Well, if they won't agree to that, you know where that money's going to go. And I don't know how somebody could ask us to vote for it when we know that that money is going to be money that causes blood to flow. So I would hope you take a look at that. There's, as you know, there's billions in South Korea and other countries that that the Iranians want freed up, and that I've heard discussion would be freed up if indeed another JCPOA deal was reached. And I'm very concerned about doing this again. I mean, we've seen exactly what happened, and that's what's going to happen again. And it's troubling. It's really, really troubling when you give money to these kind of people. So I don't know. I have irreconcilable differences with the administration on simply going back into the JCPOA that we were in before. It seems to me that we've gotten ourselves in a position, whether you agree or disagree with what the prior administration did, it's gotten us to a position where they are deeply weakened compared to when the administration took office. So I would hope you'd take advantage of it and just say no. And that's just the beginning. I mean, their testing and development of missiles in absolute violation of resolutions of the UN should not be tolerated. Why sit at a table with people that are going to look you in the eye and say, look, we don't care what you say, we don't care what the UN says, we don't care what the rest of the world says, we are going to develop missiles, and you can go pound sand, and then we hand them billions of dollars. It doesn't make sense. Well, in any event, I wish you well in it. I wish you'd say no and keep the sanctions in place. We will be willing partners, at least this senator will, as far as ratcheting up more of those sanctions against that country. Let me ask a specific question. On the money that I looked at in this budget that is going to other countries for addressing global warming, I'm really lost as to what that's going to go for. It's really vague in there. Can you help me out what it's going to be used for?
Sure. Thank you. Here's the challenge for us with dealing with global warming and dealing with climate change. We are taking significant steps to curb our emissions, but even if we do everything right, at least in the way that we see it, we're 15% of global emissions, so we do everything right, we still got 85% of the problem left. And other countries have to come along. And of course, we do not want to be the ones doing all of the work. We have to get others to do what they need to do as well to deal
Well,
with
we
problems.
can't be, can we? I mean, if we're only 15%, we can't finance the other 85%.
So it's not financing the other 85%, but there are some countries that need to take meaningful actions to curb emissions that will need assistance in developing and adapting technologies that can help them curb those emissions. So the Green Climate Fund, for example, is a way of helping countries without the means to do it to adapt technologies that will curb emissions and also build resilience against some of the challenges posed by climate change right now.
Is there a plan that we can look at in that regard and identify the countries that are going to get this money and how much they're going to get?
I believe there is, and I'm happy to share
Please do that
with you.
Go ahead.
No, I was going to say, we're happy to come back to you with the details on that.
All right. Thank you. I didn't allow you to respond on the Iranian situation.
Yes, and look, and we've had the opportunity to talk about this
we have
a number of times.
Appreciate you.
First, all of the egregious actions which we share condemnation of with you that Iran is engaged in are happening under maximum pressure. Not more. It's gotten worse, not better. So that effort did not solve the problem, a problem we all acknowledge. Whether we like it or not, and we don't like it, Iran has been engaged in these activities, including support for Hamas, including support for other terror groups, including support for proxies, engaging in destabilizing activities across the board. It was doing that before the JCPOA. It continued to do that during the JCPOA, and it's gotten worse since we got out of the JCPOA. Our challenge now, I think, is threefold. One is we have the problem that its nuclear program, now that it is not abiding by the constraints of the JCPOA, is literally galloping forward. And we talked about that a few minutes ago. But the magnitude of their enrichment, enriching more at higher levels, is putting it in a position where the breakout time is inexorably getting down from a year to months to eventually weeks. And that is a problem for us. Also, if this continues, what it is learning, what it is able to master in the time that it's doing this is going to be very hard to pull back. So we have that incentive. That's one piece. The second piece is, and I agree with both you and the chairman, that is, in my judgment, a necessary step. Put this back in the box, but an insufficient one, and we have to build on it. But not only in terms of the agreement itself, in terms of these other actions that Iran is taking that we all profoundly object to. We will retain all of the tools to do that, to push back on them for these actions. I think we will have greater cooperation and coordination from partners who over the last few years have been focused almost entirely on preserving the nuclear agreement, not actually working with us to help curb some of these other actions. So we have to be able to do all of that, and what I can tell you is we are determined to do that. But we need to put this nuclear problem back in the box that it was in and move on from there.
Well, my time's up. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. But let me just conclude by saying we both know, and the world knows, that there's another entity that's going to do something about this. Whatever the JCPOA says or doesn't say, whatever everybody else agrees to, there's another entity that has taken a solemn oath that they will never have, Iran will never have a nuclear weapon. And I guess the biggest question would be, what happens when you get the call? Thank you.
Senator Cardin.
Secretary Blinken, welcome. You've been very busy. It's a challenging world. I certainly agree with Senator Menendez, our chairman, that we welcome the budget that has been submitted for our foreign policy issues. It certainly reflects the commitment that we have a value-based foreign policy. I was particularly pleased by your statements here about your commitment to good governance. The press statement for your FY22 budget says it includes a significant increase in resources to advance human rights and democratic values, fight corruption, stem the tide of democratic backsliding, and defend against authoritarianism. And then in the INL budget, you have a particular focus on the anti-corruption activities. So you mentioned some of that during your opening statement, but I would like to drill down to one aspect of fighting corruption, which I believe is desperately needed within the State Department, and that's the capacity in each of our missions to understand the circumstances in the host country, to get the best intelligence information about their system, and what can be done to fight corruption, and then impressing upon the host country our interest in helping them in dealing with anti-corruption measures. Do we have enough resources in this budget to be able to develop that type of capacity within the missions?
Thank you, first of all, for putting a spotlight on that. Thank you for all of the work you've been doing over many years. I think of all of the bad things out there that we're dealing with, corruption in terms of the corrosive impact that it has on democracy is got to be very near the top of the list. And parenthetically, I think if we look at virtually any popular movement over the last decade or 15 years, whether it's the Tunisian fruit vendor, or whether it's Tahrir Square, or whether it's the Maidan in Ukraine, whether it's protests in Brazil, the common denominator each time is revulsion at corruption. Sometimes it's the reason. It's certainly a reason that we see people at some point just get fed up. So we're determined to make sure that we have the resources to do exactly what you're talking about in a couple of ways, and we welcome working with you going forward to make sure that this is as sharp as possible. First, we need the human resources, the expertise in the department, and the ability to support and deploy that expertise, to your point, to our embassies. So people who have the training, have the background, have the skill set to work on these issues. I think a part of our request that is so significant to me is the additional almost 500 positions. But this is not asking for just 500 positions in a vacuum. There are specific areas where we know we need to build up our capacity that we'll look to use this and other flexibilities to address. And this expertise on economic matters, on corruption is one of them. Technology is another. China is a third. Global health is a fourth. So we're very focused there. Second, we have to do this in close collaboration and coordination with the other expert agencies in our government. And that, I think, there's a real commitment to do that. The National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, who brings all of us together, is very focused on this, and so we have to do that. Third, I think you saw Vice President Harris just today announce the surging of experts to some countries in Central America to help them, to the extent they're willing to be helped, deal with endemic corruption. So we have some ability to surge expertise. The long and short of it is, though, I'd very much welcome working with you on this to make sure that we do have what we need, and we're certainly very open to ideas for how we can do this more effectively and then make sure we're resourced appropriately.
I appreciate that. And it also helps us if we then have the information we need to impose sanctions such as Global Magnitsky by having that capacity in each of our missions. The administration's talked about multinational approaches, and I certainly support multinational approaches. So let me talk about the Sustainable Development Goals that were created in 2015. Goal 16 deals with good governance, which is the areas that we're talking about here, and getting our international support for efforts to make significant improvements in governance. The prior administration failed to support the UN Joint SDG Fund, which is the sole UN funding vehicle for to catalyze to energize private sector and other resources to support the SDGs. Given President Biden and your renewed commitment to American multilateralism and sustainable development, what steps will this administration take in order to advance the SDG goals, particularly Goal 16?
I think we need to make sure that we are dedicating our appropriate share of resources to advance these goals. This is one of the reasons we want to try to make right by our commitments to international institutions and to various programs in those institutions that advance the interests of the United States. Parenthetically, when we don't do that, our influence and our ability to shape how these programs are carried out is diminished or lost. So we have an interest in making sure that the focus that these institutions bring to the problem is appropriate and effective. But the long and short of it is we believe we need to fund our commitments and then be at the table in the room to help carry them out.
And I would just add, in multinationalism, the Organization of American States, the OSCE, and other international organizations where the United States leadership can play a critical role to focus those organizations, in addition to the United Nations, in these values that are critically important to our national security. I would just urge you to work with us to see whether we can't be more effective in getting multinational focus on dealing with corruption. I want to add my view in regards to the Iran circumstance. I agree with Chairman Menendez. He and I had similar views on the JCPOA and President Trump's decision to lead the JCPOA. But just make one point. The JCPOA was a lifetime prohibition about Iran being able to have a nuclear weapons program.
That's correct.
So we had sunsets that would be irrelevant to that lifetime commitment. So when you talk about whatever we get back into an agreement, it's got to make sure that there's a lifetime prohibition about Iran ever becoming a nuclear weapon state, and you have functioning agreements that you can identify to make sure they never get within a year of breakout.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, I was part of an effort led by Senator Cruz and Senator Shaheen to impose sanctions to stop the building of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. I have to admit, honestly, I was surprised at how unbelievably effective those sanctions were, and it stopped it. When you came before this committee about 5 months ago, I thought you were completely on board with the continued halting of the construction of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. I have to admit, I'm shocked at now the fact that yesterday and today you are conceding the fact that it's going to get built. That would have been really nice to know 5 months ago. When did your thinking change on that?
Thank you, Senator. Again, as we discussed then, unfortunately, construction started on this bad idea in 2018, and when we last spoke, the pipeline was well over 90% complete as a physical.
Yes, and it was quite complete when we imposed sanctions and halted it last time. Why not continue to pause the sanctions? I'm sorry, your explanation literally makes no sense. So now we're conceding the building. We're going to have it constructed, and now we're going to somehow impose serious consequences when Germany doesn't live up to providing the revenue relief for Ukraine when Russia does use it as a weapon?
As a practical matter, as we looked at this, we all agreed this pipeline is a bad idea. We oppose it. The President has been clear about that for a long time. But as a very practical matter, with inheriting a pipeline that was 95% complete, none of the...
We stopped it the last time. Let's move on to Iran.
No, in fact, we didn't, by definition.
Let's move on to Iran. During the debate over the JCPOA, I offered an amendment to deem that a treaty. From my standpoint, that amendment should have passed 100-0. And had it passed 100-0, the JCPOA would have been, first, a far better agreement, and you wouldn't be in a position where from one administration to the next, a president can just cancel another executive agreement. So now you're engaged in further discussions with Iran. I have my doubts that you will end up with a better agreement. It's going to be worse. It'll embolden Iran. Don't you think, first of all, what justification is there, something that is that significant? And again, you take a look at the State Department's own manuals in terms of how it defines a treaty. I think it's quite clear that the original JCPOA was a treaty. Don't you think any agreement that you enter into with Iran should be deemed a treaty and should be ratified in the United States Senate?
Senators, you know, numerous arms control and nonproliferation agreements reached by the United States were not treaties. And there are benefits, you're right, to enshrining something in a treaty. There are also downsides in terms of some of the constraints that it actually would place on us. It's also more complicated when you're dealing with a multi-party agreement, which was the case of the JCPOA. We had, of course, the European partners. We had the Russians, the Chinese, not to mention the Iranians. So looking at the history of arms control non-proliferation agreements, looking at what would give us maximum flexibility, and this was the the most effective way forward.
Okay, well, respectfully disagree. Real quick, I did send a letter together with Senator Scott inquiring as to why the State Department ended its investigation regarding the gain of function and the lab leak origination of the coronavirus. I think your response is due on June 10th. I'm hoping you'll respond and provide us the information we're requesting. Are you aware of that letter?
Yes, thank you, Senator. I am, and just to, and we'll certainly respond to that in a timely fashion. But just to, for what it's worth, to try to clear this up, because there's been a lot, unfortunately, of erroneous reporting on this. The study in question, the work in question, was asked for by the Trump administration. They hired a contractor within the State Department to do an internal inquiry into the origins of COVID-19 with a focus on the lab leak scenario. That work was completed. It wasn't terminated.
Okay, so just explain that when you return it to me. I want to move on to another issue. So just respond to my oversight request. Finally, I want to talk about the budget as it relates to what the Biden administration is proposing to spend, I guess, to fix Central America. My first trip down to Central America, it was interesting what the presidents of those countries talked about in terms of problems they were dealing with. And first it was corruption and then impunity. Mm-hmm. Obviously, I understand corruption. I thought impunity, that's odd. I mean, what are you talking about there? And the fact of the matter is, they're talking about the fact that the drug cartels are untouchable. And by the way, the drug cartels in Central America, because through our drug interdiction efforts, we stopped, or we certainly redirect the flow through the Caribbean and up to Central America, destroying those societies in many respects. So I don't know what amount of money we can spend in Central America to really address the drug lords. I keep hearing the root cause of this problem is the violence in Central America. I would argue the root cause of the violence in Central America is America's insatiable demand for drugs. So the border crisis, which is the current crisis, is completely the result of the actions that President Biden took when he first entered office, ending the successful migrant protection policy, the agreements with those countries, and quite honestly, not completing the 250 miles of border wall that is bought and paid for. So I listened to Vice President Harris talking about, we're going to secure the border. I see no evidence of that. So tell me how you can expect a few $100 million or I don't exactly know the exact amount you're really proposing over the next couple of years during this administration of pouring into Central America to try and fix the push factor when the push factor is caused by our insatiable demand for drugs and the flow of migrants. And by the way, the presidents of those countries were pleading with me and on a bipartisan basis to other Senate colleagues, please fix your laws. This isn't good for us to lose our future, to have this outflow of people. We need to rebuild our economies. So please explain how these policies are going to result in anything and how that money isn't going to just be completely wasted in Central America.
Thank you. There are a number of things that we need to do and do it at the same time. We have to have, and we're determined to have, and we will have a secure border. We have to have a rational immigration policies, and we have to deal with these drivers. And I think it's fair to say that folks don't just wake up in the morning in Guatemala or Honduras or El Salvador and say, boy, it would be a lot of fun to just give up everything I know, my family, my language, my culture, my community, take this incredibly hazardous journey, put myself in the hands of coyotes, come to the United States, and the border's closed in any event, and that would be a great thing to do. We know that there are very, very serious things in their lives that are pushing them to take these chances. And these are things that I think we can help address. To your point, you're right. I think there are a number of factors involved. The corruption, lack of good governance, the impunity in terms of violence. The single biggest driver in most places, in my estimation, though, is fundamentally a lack of opportunity, a lack of a job, a lack of a paycheck, being able to put money on the table, feed their families. And this is a place where I think we can have a real impact, working primarily with the private sector, which has to be the engine for these kinds of investments. The government can help and be a catalyst. We need to see that. Of course, governments need to do the work to put in place some of the laws and structures that make private investment more possible. So we're working on that as well. But if, Senators, we don't also deal with these drivers, you know, it's just very hard to overcome the choice that people make to, you know, put their lives in someone else's hands to try to come here. We have to be able to do all of that, and that's where the President's plan go. I'd be happy when, the time comes. This is not just throwing money at the problem. There are and will be serious metrics, serious oversight, serious benchmarks for what we're trying to accomplish. And last thing I'd mention on this, if I can, part of the challenge is that you have governments that we can't work effectively with because of corruption and because of gross mismanagement. Well, we'll be working with others, with the private sector, with civil society, with NGOs, with organizations that do this work, with local communities, as the case may be, to try to make sure that any funds that we ask our taxpayers to dedicate to this are used wisely and effectively and are not wasted. And I really welcome an opportunity to work with this committee on that.
Thank you. For the information of all members, there's a vote that started at 3:07. It's the chair's intention to continue to work through and rotate as members come in and out because we have a time finite with the secretary and we have members who want to ask questions. So I'm going to work through these votes. With that, Senator Shaheen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Mr. Secretary. Thank you for being here and for the hard work that you're doing to restore America's credibility in the international community. I have, in New Hampshire, we have a short border with Canada, but I have a number of constituents who have relatives in Canada. We have a number of businesses who do business in Canada. There is a lot of cross-border traffic, and the border closure has been a real hardship for so many of our citizens. My office heard from a constituent in Belmont, whose mother had passed away in January in New Brunswick. He wanted to go to the funeral because they couldn't delay it any later than May 31st. The Canadian government told him in order to do that, he would have to quarantine for 5 days. He couldn't take the time off from work. He couldn't get a waiver. And so I appreciate that this has been a joint agreement between Canada and the United States. But at this point, given the increasing vaccination rate on both sides of the border, I hope that you will commit to doing everything you can to get that border open so that the hardship that my constituents and other constituents are experiencing will end and they can resume normal relationships with their families and business in the way that will benefit them.
I very much appreciate, Senator, those hardships for all of the border states with Canada. This is something that I've engaged my Canadian counterpart on multiple times. We're trying to work through these challenges, and I've gotten some, I think, relatively more positive feedback from him recently that I'm happy to share with you. It's a work in progress, and if there are specific instances or cases, please as well bring them to my attention, to our attention, so that I can also share them with our counterparts. But to your point, I think we're hopefully getting to the point. We certainly are. Canada's a little bit behind where we are, but we're getting to a better point.
Well, good. I appreciate that, particularly as we're getting into the tourism season. There's a lot of cross-border traffic between Canada and the United States, and it's critical to our state and others along the border. I want to follow up with the questions that have already been asked about Nord Stream 2, because as you know, this is something that I have been very concerned about. And I just returned from a trip to Kyiv with my colleagues, Senators Murphy and Portman, who were also along. And one of the things we heard very loudly from our Ukrainian partners was just how devastating the loss of revenue will be once Russians stop using Ukraine as a transit route. Also, the concern about giving Russia another weapon to use against Europe. And the other potential ramifications of the fallout from completion of Nord Stream 2. So you talked about trying to make the Ukrainians whole in terms of the transit fees, but can you also discuss what else we can do to support Ukraine if this pipeline becomes operational, and what the Germans might be willing to do in that regard?
Certainly. And I think there are a number of things that, that we're looking at, that we need to look at, and of course need Germany and others to look at and ultimately take action on. One is the possibility of actually extending the existing transit agreement for many years into the future, so that Ukraine would continue to benefit from the transit fees. If that doesn't work, I think finding ways to make Ukraine whole for the lost transit fees is something that the Europeans would need to step up to. The other side of the coin that you just alluded to is making sure that we have in place, and Europe has in place, appropriate reserves and appropriate means to counter any attempt by Russia to use gas or oil as a coercive political tool, so that they can't be subject to blackmail. There's another thing that's really important here, which sometimes gets missed in the equation, which is Ukraine's own energy potential and efficiency potential is very, very much unrealized. And if Ukraine used energy more efficiently than it does, a lot of the leverage that Russia might acquire will be diminished significantly. So there's a lot of work to be done there. Finally, I think that when it comes to Russian misbehavior in general in that part of the world, we're looking to our allies and partners to commit up front to taking action and to taking steps in response, so that we don't have to scramble if Russia does something bad to try to bring people along. All of that and more is on the table, and we're looking to Germany in particular to make good on some of these things.
Well, thank you. As you've heard, this is a very important bipartisan issue for this committee and for Congress, and we will be watching closely and trying to be helpful in any way we can as we figure out how to negate the potential weapon that Russia could have against not just Ukraine, but all of Western Europe. I want to go back to Afghanistan. You alluded to some of the challenges there in your opening statement. And we saw on May 8th a bombing of a school in Kabul, a girls' school, which resulted in about 80 deaths. Many were the schoolgirls. And we know what the Taliban's position is on women and girls. We've seen the deliberate assassination efforts against women who are working. So what steps is the State Department taking to provide for the safety of women and girls after our military has left the country? And do we have a focal point in the State Department for someone who is working on these issues, who we can continue to talk with as we hear from the women leaders in Afghanistan who are so worried about what's going to happen?
Yeah. First, just with regard to the attack that you referenced, I mean, we all know, we witness horrible things happening every single day in places that we're all focused on. I've got to say, that one in particular, I think it's hard to think of anything more horrific. The deliberate murder of these young girls in a school. That hit me profoundly as well.
Thank you, and I would just point out that this committee and the Senate just passed a resolution condemning that attack, which I hope sends an important message, not just to the Taliban, but to the women of Afghanistan.
Well, I think it is important, and it does, because here's what's important. First, even as we withdraw our forces from Afghanistan and NATO withdraws its forces, we are not withdrawing from Afghanistan. We are determined to sustain a strong embassy and a strong diplomatic presence. We're working with other partner countries so that they do the same. We're trying to put in place what is necessary to sustain that, and we'll look forward to actually sharing that with the committee in the weeks ahead. And as a result, to continue most of the programs that we've had in place. We've committed over the years, as you know better than I do, nearly $800 million to programs for women and girls in Afghanistan. We plan to sustain that programming, also more broadly economic development, humanitarian security force support. I acknowledge it's not going to be necessarily a simple proposition. It comes with real challenges, but I believe that with the right embassy presence and the right team, we can sustain these programs and we can provide appropriate oversight to make sure the money is being well spent. That's one piece. The other piece is a future Afghanistan that does not uphold these basic rights, including the gains made for women and girls, is going to be a pariah internationally. It is not going to have support from anyone, certainly not from the United States. That also, I think, is going to have to get factored into the thinking of future governance in Afghanistan.
Well, thank you. I'm out of time, but I certainly hope that's the case and that the United States will continue to lead the charge on getting support from the international community to hold the Taliban accountable for what they're doing.
Thank you.
Senator Romney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Secretary, it's good to see you and appreciate the work that you're leading and applaud many of the initiatives that you've described today and that you're carrying out. One thing you said today that I want to make a comment about, which is that looking in Central America to try and deal with some of the illegal immigration crisis that we're seeing at the border and attempting to deal with some of the root causes, as you described it, of illegal immigration. And some funding providing to the Central Americans to help deal with some of those root causes. I'm concerned that a lot of that funding is going to end up in corrupt hands. I'd also note that fighting crime and poverty there is quite a task because we have crime and poverty here that we haven't been able to solve. How we're going to solve them in someone else's country is beyond me. And I also believe that the great majority of people who come here illegally come here for better opportunity, which is part of our free enterprise system as opposed to the socialism they're living under, and for freedom. And they're in autocracies. And so I would note that I think the best solutions to this crisis are completing the barrier, mandatory E-Verify. These are the kinds of things I think will make the difference. But let me note on another topic. I'm concerned about what I read about Mexico and about the number of assassinations that have occurred in Mexico leading up to their elections. And it read, and I don't have the sources of information that you have, obviously, but it read as if it was almost a failed state. We're not just talking about a few. We're talking about, I think the number was like over 80 people had been assassinated leading up to the elections. This is extraordinary. This is a country that is apparently being ridden with crime lords taking over the government. How bad is it, and is there effort that we can help support the government in trying to bring stability to that country?
Senator, I very much share your concern about that, about insecurity in general, this political violence as well in particular, and of course the violence being perpetrated by these drug gangs, transnational criminal organizations that are involved. One of the things that we've done is re-engaged with the Mexicans to restart and hopefully really re-energize the work that we've been doing together on security. So we have a high-level dialogue on security issues that is now restarting, as well as one on economic issues. And so I believe that we can be helpful to the Mexicans in getting a better grip on some of this violence. I acknowledge not easy at all, but necessary. And there too would welcome working with this committee on good ideas to try to advance that. But the bottom line is we're re-engaged with the Mexican government on security issues to see if we can be helpful.
Thank you. Another topic going across the world in Taiwan. I'm very concerned that what the Taiwanese are hearing from the Chinese is harming our interests there and the interests of freedom. According to the ambassador from Taiwan, she indicated that she received social media that said that Americans have so much vaccine that we're using it to provide vaccines for our animals, our pets, our dogs, and our cats, and that the lives of Taiwanese is not worth as much as an American dog. Clearly, it's in our interest, in a very critical nation of the world, to see vaccinations that we have available going to Taiwan. I'm concerned if COVAX is the source of providing those vaccines, that COVAX will be, if you will, pressured by China, will not give the Taiwanese what they need. Are we giving directly the vaccinations that Taiwan needs? And can we make the number large enough? I understand it was announced at 750,000 doses. If that's a Pfizer or Moderna dose, that's half that number in terms of vaccinated people. They need something much closer to 2 million. Can we be more? I just hope that you'll bring extra attention to that issue.
Senator, in short, yes. We're making sure that vaccines do get to Taiwan. And just to be clear about what we're doing and how we're doing it, the President announced, as you know, that we would be pushing out between now and early July 80 million vaccine doses, to include a combination of AstraZeneca, but also Pfizer, Moderna. And we're doing some of that in coordination with COVAX, but even in coordination with COVAX, we can direct where the vaccines go, and some of it just directly. The first 25 million doses is what we describe the allocation for those, to include doses for Taiwan. There are another 55 million to follow, again, between now and early July. And then beyond that, two things are very important. One is we'll continue after the 80 million to provide excess doses in the months ahead as we have them, because we will have them. Parenthetically, the 80 million doses, we will, by a factor of 5, be the leading country in sharing vaccines with the world, by a factor of 5. China's sold a lot to other countries, but in terms of actually giving them to other countries, by a factor of 5. But equally important, we are working very hard right now on significantly increasing production capabilities so that we can make sure that more vaccines are produced more quickly and that we can be the leader in vaccinating the world. And of course, as you know, that's also profoundly, it's not just the right thing to do, it's profoundly in our interest, because as long as this virus is replicating somewhere, it's going to be mutating, and if it's mutating, it could come back to bite us. So we have a strong incentive to get ahead of this, and I believe that with the work that we're doing, the President's doing on this, we will be the leader in making sure that the world's vaccinated, including Taiwan.
I have very little time, and so that means you have very little time for this answer. But I'm coming back from Europe and the meeting with the G7. To what extent are you comfortable with or have confidence in the reaction of our other G7 members to the threat that's posed by China?
I think, Senator, quickly, and I'm happy to go into more detail at another time, I think there's a rising appreciation for the challenges posed by China, including, for example, when it comes to technology and their various networks. We spent a lot of time talking about that, about resilient supply chains. That concern is rising across the board. Now, there are differences, among certain countries, but I think the work that the Senate is doing, including, I believe, this afternoon, is going to have a very meaningful impact, and we appreciate that.
Thank you.
Senator Coons.
Mr. Secretary, good to talk with you again following this morning's Appropriations Committee hearing. Just following up on what Senator Romney and you were just discussing, I think this is an important moment for bold vaccine diplomacy by the United States. We have long been a world leader in public health. We have, because of the efforts of this administration and the previous one, developed the world-leading, most effective vaccines. Because of President Biden's relentless focus on vaccinating the American people, we're now at the threshold of 70% vaccination in a number of states, and I do think it's time for bold vaccine diplomacy. What more could we be doing in the Senate on a bipartisan basis to send a strong signal of support for taking decisive steps? I think the announcement last week was terrific. What I heard in both Taiwan and South Korea, as well as from other countries, was very encouraging. But what else would be helpful for you to hear from Congress about this initiative?
Thank you for putting a spotlight on that, because I could not agree more with Senator Romney on the importance of this, and also honestly the opportunity to show our leadership. So I think the next most important step beyond the vaccines that we have available to share is increasing significantly production capacity in the United States as well as in other parts of the world. If we stay on the current trajectory in terms of the vaccines produced and the pace at which they're being administered, we're not going to get to global herd immunity, roughly 70%, as you know very well, until 2024. That's unacceptable, or at least it should be. We do, I believe, especially if we manage to significantly increase production and then share that production, we can get there a lot faster. So I think, I think the president will be coming back to you on this, in the relatively near future, things that we can do to boost production.
As you know, I had a hand in the BUILD Act and in standing up the DFC. Yeah. I think it's a tool that, in partnership with some of our key allies, could be critical. While in South Korea, I had a number of conversations about vaccine partnership in terms of manufacturing. Would be excited to work with you on this. Let me move on to the questions that have been raised a number of times today about the Northern Triangle. I'll add to that the Sahel. Two areas of the world where we've got significant fragility, a band of several states in West Africa, a grouping of 3 states in Central America, where corruption, impunity, widespread insecurity, the impacts of climate change are having a dramatic impact. The Global Fragility Act is a bill that was signed into law that Senator Lindsey Graham and I worked hard on that provides a framework for accountability, for metrics, and for a State Department-led partnership between state, USAID, and DOD on dealing with fragility. How do you see the Global Fragility Act framework being relevant to places like the Sahel or the Northern Triangle, and how can that help focus the difficult work the Vice President is currently leading in terms of investing in stabilizing 3 very difficult and troubled, 3 countries that have a very troubled current status, but where successfully stabilizing them is essential to our security and stability as well?
A couple things. First, thank you for mentioning the Sahel, and thank you for your work there as well. I think we have a deep concern about spreading instability in the Sahel. We have roughly 20 million people who are in need in that area: Burkina Faso, Chad, Mali, Niger, Mauritania. And that, of course, becomes a breeding ground for violent extremism, as we've seen. We are partnered with a number of other countries to act on countering violent extremism, on governance, on humanitarian. We're the largest humanitarian donor in the neighborhood, as you know. In March, we had an additional $80 million or so. But to the more specific point, I think the Global Fragility Act is a very important vehicle for us to be able to advance this work. The budget request that we have before you includes $185 million to help implement the Global Fragility Act. There's $125 million for the Prevention and Stabilization Fund. I think $25 million above the FY21 enacted budget. $60 million for the Complex Crises Fund, which there is, I think, roughly $30 million above the FY21 enacted. So the resources would support the actual implementation of the Act to try to do what you set out to do, which is to actually anticipate and prevent a conflict, because an ounce of prevention, right, beats a pound of cure. But also to support these inclusive, locally driven political processes to try to stabilize some of these conflict-ridden places, work with our external partners, improve and integrate our capabilities. So right now where we are is we're finalizing the selection of 5 priority countries or regions based on our assessment of the data, the opportunity for impact, and national security priorities. And we're doing that across the administration with the relevant departments and agencies. And then as we get that settled, we want to come to you and consult on that, share our thinking, and then refine it and then go to the president for final approval.
Wonderful. Last question. I don't mean to seem churlish because you've just dedicated a huge amount of time to testifying in front of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, House Appropriations, Senate Appropriations, and the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. But in the context that many of us have worked in, your two predecessors appeared once. And we had enormous difficulty getting them back to testify in front of Foreign Relations or Appropriations and to engage around their budgets. That was at a time when they were proposing dramatic cuts in spending. I'm very encouraged by the budget that the administration's putting forward for the State Department, for AID, for a number of other critical international functions. Can we count on you to come back? Because you are such a good advocate for the State Department, as someone who's served for decades here in the Senate and in foreign policy. I just want to make sure that we're going to have another opportunity for you to engage with the Appropriations Committee and Foreign Relations Committee as we try and enact a robust budget that meets the needs of this moment.
I'm committed to engaging this committee as well as the appropriations committees in a whole variety of ways, whether it's in hearings, in private conversations, in individual conversations. I made a commitment to the chairman during the confirmation process that I would do that, and I'll be held to that.
Great. Thank you very much, Mr. Secretary.
Thank you. And to the Secretary's credit, he has kept his word on that. Senator Portman is with us virtually, I understand.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Secretary, for being here. I'll get right down to my questions. As you know from Senator Shaheen's comments, I was on this congressional delegation recently to Lithuania, to Ukraine, and to Georgia. We spent quite a bit of time talking about the Belarus issues in Lithuania, including meeting with the opposition leader. I want to start by just saying it won't surprise you to hear that I strongly disagree with the administration's position on Nord Stream 2, which is a reversal of a previous position. And waiving the congressionally mandated sanctions on Nord Stream 2 is going to have a detrimental impact on these other countries in the region, particularly Ukraine, where the pipeline currently goes through Ukraine, where there's about a $3 billion fee that is badly needed in Ukraine these days, and that's in our interest. But one issue that has come to my attention that I had not fully realized was the threat they're feeling, not just from their eastern border, where Russia has recently sent 110,000 troops and left equipment there, by the way, and left most of those troops, but also on the northern border with Belarus, where Russia's military presence is increasing. So more and more pressure on them. And again, something that perhaps isn't fully understood is that the pipeline itself, in a way, was a way to encourage the safety of Ukraine, and that Russia would be unlikely to want to destroy its own pipeline should it make a mistake and engage in further aggression towards Ukraine. So can you comment on why you changed your mind? I assume you've already talked about this today. I wasn't able to listen to all the testimony. And how you answer Ukraine, when they say, among other things, that no one even bothered to talk to President Zelensky about it before this decision was made.
Thank you very much, Senator. Yes, we did have an opportunity to talk about this a little bit before, but just to focus in on it again. First, let me just say, President Biden spoke to President Zelensky today. He invited him to Washington in the coming weeks, and they had a very good conversation. Also, for the record, we did share with our Ukrainian partners our intentions when it came to the pipeline, and maybe that information didn't get directly to President Zelensky. It certainly should have.
Well, I think it certainly should have been communicated to him. And by the way, I do appreciate the fact that the phone call was made. Thank you. I'm sure you played a big role in that. Not as good as having Georgia and Ukraine present, at least for a 10 or 15-minute session with the NATO summit. And that's what I think is really needed, because otherwise it just sends the wrong signal to Russia. And, this is something that I know you understand well, but these signals are important. And it's the narrative and it's the disinformation that Russia will now engage in that makes it even more difficult for Ukraine at a very difficult time. I won't ask you to go into your explanation. I'll find it from the previous questions, but I must say I'm disappointed. And I know that you yourself, had a strong view on this at one point, that Nord Stream 2 is not something that was in our interest. With regard to an ambassador to Ukraine, we've got a good career team there, as you know. You were there recently, and thank you for making the trip. we need an ambassador. I assume you heard this from all the folks in the government in Ukraine as we did. I've been there with an ambassador and without an ambassador, and it's a big difference. And as you know, we came very close to getting General Dayton through the process last time. Why have you all not nominated someone, and what's your plan on nominating an ambassador for Ukraine?
Thank you, Senator. We're trying to move forward on that as quickly as possible, and we have a process that I'm sure you're familiar with at the State Department in terms of putting forward ambassadors. We're in the midst of that process now, and I anticipate that that will happen in relatively short order. But let me just say that is a priority for us and for the President. I want to make sure that we have the strongest possible person leading the strongest possible team in Ukraine.
Well, Mr. Secretary, when you nominate someone, I assume it'll be a career person who has a good background, and I'm glad you're looking to someone who has experience because it's a critical post. But I'll be one of those who will be very eager to help you get that through the process as quickly as possible. I know the Chair and Ranking Member will agree with me. On the NATO map issue, in 2008, then Senator Biden introduced a resolution calling for a NATO membership action plan for Ukraine and for Georgia. And by the way, that was the same year, as you know, that NATO said they were going to have both Georgia and Ukraine come into NATO. It was a question of when. That resolution passed the Senate easily. It had support of a lot of members, including a senator named Obama, one named Clinton, one named McCain, totally bipartisan. Does this administration still support a membership action plan for Ukraine and Georgia?
We support Ukraine membership in NATO. It currently has all of the tools it needs because since the membership action plan was created, a number of other very important tools were developed to help countries prepare for possible NATO membership, including an annual program that Ukraine benefits from. And in our estimation, Ukraine has all the tools that it needs to continue to move forward in that direction. And so we're working with it on virtually a daily basis. MAP itself would have to be done in full consensus with other NATO members. I think there are some countries that are less supportive than others of that right now. But irrespective of MAP, Ukraine has the tools it needs to move forward toward being ready for membership in the future. The other piece of this, though, as you know, and given all the time and investment you've made on this, as important as its preparations militarily, strategically, is the preparation when it comes to having good governance and dealing with the aggression that's eating at Ukraine from within, and that is corruption and a system that works effectively to deal with it. So what we also need to see from Ukraine is continued progress on that level as well.
Well, and of course, there's been enormous progress made. We have looked back only to 2014 when that began, and the electoral changes, the judicial reforms, and others, some of the economic reforms have been substantial. And I agree, more need to be done, and more has to be done, frankly, I think, in order for NATO membership to be completed. But I would hope, as I said earlier about the narrative, that we're not backing off on membership action plan, understanding that you've got to convince the other NATO members to go along. The United States tends to have significant influence in NATO, and we're their champion. We're the country they look to, and they're under enormous pressure right now. This buildup on the eastern border is something that mystifies everybody, except that Russia must have some designs on continuing their aggression and holding on to Crimea and the Donbass. So, and then again, what's happening in Belarus is an additional very serious concern. So my time is probably over, but the Global Engagement Center that we talked about, and we look forward to following up with you about the Global Engagement Center.
Thank you.
Budget request. Thank you, Mr. Secretary.
Thank you, Senator.
All right. Senator Kaine.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Secretary. This has been very helpful. Because members have been putting down their views about the JCPOA, I'm going to do the same thing. I was one of the largest proponents of the JCPOA on this committee, and I continue to be, and I believe it was disastrous for the Trump administration to back out of it. The first sentence of the first paragraph, as I recall, said that Iran reaffirms that it will never seek to purchase, acquire, or develop a nuclear weapon.
That is correct.
An enforceable agreement.
That is correct.
Signed before the entire global community, not only with allies, the United States, with adversaries, the United States, Russia, and China. Permanent, enforceable, would give the U.S. grounds for, I think, defendable military action should Iran have violated it.
That's correct.
The agreement contained many other provisions with respect to limitations on Iran's nuclear program. Now, many of those provisions were temporary. Some expired in 5 years, some expired in 10, some expired in 15, some expired in 25. But there was one other permanent part of the agreement. At year 8 in the agreement, the Iranian legislature was required to permanently embrace the additional protocol inspection requirements of the IAEA, which at the time and today was the state of the art in terms of inspection. So a permanent agreement never to purchase, acquire, develop nuclear weapons, and a permanent inspection regime that would enable us to determine if they were violating their agreement. And what did we give up to get that? What did we give up? The ranking member said, we gave them a lot of money. We gave them their money. Great work by Chairman Menendez and others in putting a sanctions regime in place had led us to be able to freeze money that was not our money, wasn't American taxpayer dollars, it was Iranian money. And so they got their own money back and in exchange agreed to permanently pledge to the entire world that they would never have a nuclear program. Why the Trump administration would want to tear up that agreement and allow Iran to go back to, okay, I guess we don't have to abide by our side of it anymore. I just am continuously flummoxed by it. So if you could return to a compliance for compliance, it wouldn't turn Iran into a good actor, but they would be a bad actor without a nuclear program rather than a bad actor rushing toward a nuclear program. I'll never forget, as a member of this committee, going to Israel in January of 2015 with the then chairman, Republican Bob Corker, to sit in Prime Minister Netanyahu's office and ask about what Israel thought about our nuclear negotiations. The prime minister was completely against it. We had a meeting scheduled the next day with Tamir Pardo, the head of Mossad in Tel Aviv. The prime minister told us that meeting was canceled, that we were not going to be able to go do it. And our Republican committee chair had the backbone to look him in the face and say, if you cancel that meeting, we're canceling all the rest of the meetings here in Israel. We'll leave tomorrow. We won't have a single other meeting. Hastily, the meeting suddenly reappeared on the schedule, and we went to Tel Aviv, and we sat down in the offices of the Mossad with Tamir Pardo and others, and what they told us is, look, we don't like Iran. We don't know whether this is going to work, but what we do know is that the maximum pressure campaign is not working. We're hurting Iran's economy, but we're causing them to floor it in terms of developing a nuclear weapons program. So if you could return to compliance for compliance and get Iran once again to say, we will never seek to purchase, acquire, or develop nuclear weapons ever, and we will permanently agree to the additional protocol of the IAEA, I would be strongly supportive on one condition. There is a but to this long intro. Get American hostages out of Iran. I don't think doing a deal with American hostages still in Iran is a good idea. And I would say that would need to be a precondition for me, and I would hope that the administration would take that seriously. We had a hearing this morning in Armed Services, Mr. Secretary, about the U.S.-China relationship. And obviously, this has dominated much of the discussion, too. But I couldn't help bring up a wonderful quote of George Kennan in Foreign Affairs, 1947, the sources of Soviet conduct. Here is his quote. He basically says the way that the U.S. needs to be strong in any bilateral competition of this kind is be strong internally. Exhibitions of indecision, disunity, and internal disintegration within this country have an exhilarating effect on the whole communist movement. At each evidence of these tendencies, a thrill of hope and excitement goes through the communist world. The most important thing we can do to be strong vis-a-vis China is be strong internally. They celebrate when they see us in chaos. They celebrate when they see an attack on the U.S. Capitol by domestic insurrectionists. They celebrate when they see a Congress of the United States fighting over whether we even want to analyze what happened in order to prevent it from happening again. So you have a big job to go out to the world and get good work done with respect to shoring up China, but we've got a lot of work to do here to demonstrate unity of purpose and resolve. I think the bill that we're about to pass on the Senate floor, which is built largely on this committee's nearly unanimous work on a China bill a month or so ago, is a really good piece of this. But the other thing we need to do with respect to China, and then here's my last question for you, is what they most fear about us is not our military, not even our economy. What they most fear about us is our network of allies, because they don't really have them. People understand China is predatory, self-interested, and they're not an ally or a partner in a traditional sense. They don't like NATO. They don't like the Quad. They don't like U.S.-India cooperation. They hated the idea of a trans-Pacific partnership with the U.S. more engaged in Asia. They hate the network of alliances. So tell us about the Summit for Democracy and what the Biden administration and the State Department are going to do in planning this gathering of the global democracies to share best practices, to look in the mirror and be self-critical, and to try to improve and strengthen democratic ties. That will be the thing that will most rattle the cage of Chinese leadership.
Well, first, Senator, I don't think I have a word to add or to change based on what you just said. And actually, your description of the planning for the summit is also right on. I think we're actively doing that. We look forward to hopefully the participation of members of this committee, but well before that, to sharing our thinking in more detail about what we're doing. But to the point that you just made, I think this is an opportunity for countries democratic countries to come together to look at the different challenges to democracy that we're each facing, including internally, because there's a lot of common denominators that manifest itself in different ways. But we want to have that conversation, as well as looking at what we can do to strengthen, to shore up, to make more resilient democracies around the world, as well as have a common agenda on a number of the most critical issues, dealing with autocracies being right at the top of the list. But I'm looking forward to an opportunity hopefully in the relatively near future, to starting to share some more detailed thinking and to get thinking from this committee about how we can make this and by the way, not just a one-off, but part of an ongoing process and ongoing dialogue among democracies to deal with the challenges we face.
I'm over my time. Thanks for your indulgence, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Senator Haggerty.
To work here. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Secretary, it's good to be with you again today. Mr. Secretary, I'd like to applaud you for your support of the Abraham Accords. As recently as April of this year, you were at the Israeli embassy here to the United States, speaking in a very positive vein about what the Abraham Accords have done to bring peace and stability to a very important region of the world in the Middle East. I'd also applaud our National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, who talked about this in late January, specifically saying that the Abraham Accords brought about greater security for the region, greater economic prosperity for the region, and it was in America's interest. Mm-hmm. And I agree with those statements. I was just in Israel, as I mentioned to you this morning, and I met with a number of Israeli business leaders while I was there. They have every interest in seeing the progress that is underway, continue. I was encouraged by the fact that they are doing business right now. I met with two businessmen who are doing business in the UAE and trying to continue this momentum forward. I think that it is a very positive development that is undertaken. I think the momentum in that direction has been very positive. I look forward to your comments on how you would continue to move us down that lane.
Yeah, Senator, I couldn't agree with you more. And I think two things that we're working on. One is with those countries that are already part of the Accords, that is, they are moving forward on normalization one way or another with Israel. We are engaged with them as well as with Israel and looking to see how we can be supportive, how we can help move that process forward. If there are any moments where things get a little bit stuck, maybe we can help unstick things. But to your point, I think people are extremely receptive, and this is going to have, I think, very positive, concrete manifestations in people's lives, in particular because of the increased business, trade, economic relationships, among other things. Second, though, is we are also looking to see if there are countries that are not yet part of the accords that might be interested in joining. We're very actively looking at that and talking to countries that may have an interest and encouraging them in that direction.
I appreciate Senator Kuhn's comments in this regard, and I would join him to say we look forward to working with you and utilizing the tools that have already been developed with the Development Finance Corporation and others that we can utilize to continue to move down this path, because I think that prosperity will breed peace, and I think the momentum is important there. Another side of this, though, is Iran. And those same people expressed to me a concern about our appeasement of Iran. And were we to continue moving in this direction, it's going to make it more difficult for us in the Middle East. I appreciate the reasons why the Europeans are there in Vienna trying to encourage this, but our partners and our allies in the Middle East are very concerned about our posture toward Iran. I mentioned this to you earlier this morning, but to the extent that Iran were to receive sanctions relief, I'm very concerned that those dollars not find their way back to proxies like Hamas and Hezbollah. I just witnessed the devastation on the ground of what that Iranian technology and Iranian funding can do and can deliver in terms of the havoc and death to civilians through that. I also am concerned about the aid to the Palestinian Authority. With Hamas's involvement in the Gaza Strip, the efforts to rebuild, the Israeli leaders that I met with were very clear to me that those funds find their way into tunnels. They described a water project that had been funded for the Gaza area, that the pipes for the water project got converted into weaponry that landed in Israel. I think it's going to take a tremendous amount of diligence. I would prefer to not do this until Hamas is their grip on the area has been changed, and I'm going to be very focused on, again, seeing that we be very good stewards of taxpayer dollars and not allow these dollars in any way or respect to get into the hands of terrorists again. Iran is again restated its willingness and desire to rearm Hamas and help them build their terrorism infrastructure. So I am extraordinarily concerned about any move that would put more financial capability into the hands of Iran. I'd like to turn our discussion, though, for a bit to the East Asia Pacific region. You have, and I've discussed this, I think that the Indo-Pacific strategy is absolutely critical to American safety and prosperity. The Biden administration's own plans underscore the fact that China is the only nation that's really capable of mounting resistance to America and becoming a greater and greater threat, not only to America, but to the world every day. The State Department plays a very important role in this region. And looking at the budget, the allocation of resources there, we put more resources in Africa, we put more resources in the Bureau of European and Eurasian Affairs than we do in the East Asia Pacific region. And I just wanted to get your thoughts about the resourcing of the State Department in this area and where you see it going.
I very much appreciate that, and appreciate as well all of the work that you've done, including in prior capacities in this area. Look, to your point, this is the Indo-Pacific is the front line of the competition with China. China dedicates about 50% of its assistance and 50% of its economic diplomacy to the Indo-Pacific. We have asked for in the budget resources to help contend with that, but this has to be a whole of government enterprise. We talked a little bit earlier, for example, about the DFC, something I know you know very well, and other instruments that we have to compete more effectively and that we're determined to bring to bear. But I think we're looking at this politically, and of course I think it was very important that the President convened the first ever leaders level meeting of the Quad, and we're moving forward on that. We have working groups among the Quad countries, the United States, India, Australia, Japan.
I applaud that effort.
And then at the same time, there is, of course, the economic aspect of this, where things like the DFC and others come into play. There is the military and deterrent piece that's very important and that we're working on. In other words, we have to work this across the entire government. But let me just to assure you, in terms of our focus and our resources, we believe, as you do, that the Indo-Pacific is a critical destination for them.
Thank you. I'll just close with one comment. I was very encouraged by your report from the G7 that your counterparts are appreciating and understanding the threat from China, particularly from a technology standpoint. And you and I have talked about this before. The Clean Network Initiative, I think, is a great is a great piece of work that's been undertaken. I want to continue to encourage you to undertake that effort, however you decide to name it. But I think that it can have a terrific impact in terms of bringing our allies together to support a clean network around the world. Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Senator Markey. I'm going to ask Senator Schatz, would you preside so that I can go vote? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good to see you again, Mr. Secretary. When you were here last, you committed to oversee an interagency process to determine whether the atrocities committed against the Rohingya minority in Burma constitute genocide. Since then, the same military leaders who orchestrated atrocities against the Rohingya have seized power in a violent coup against the elected government, and it's estimated that more than 800 people have been killed in this ongoing crackdown. Could you update us on what the status of the genocide determination process is and when you expect to make a decision?
It is ongoing and actively ongoing. I can't put a date to it. I need to actually check with my colleagues to see exactly when they expect to complete it, but I can tell you it is very much actively ongoing. At the same time, we're doing other work, including supporting the work of this UN investigative mechanism to try to collect and preserve evidence that will be very important as well. But I'm happy to come back to you with
Thank you.
a better timeline.
Again, I think the more that it can be done on an expedited basis would be the better. Justice delayed is justice denied for these people, so it would be, I think, very helpful for them to know that the U.S. government is on their side. The Burmese military junta continue to attack peaceful citizen protesters and denies its citizens basic human rights and democratic rule. The recent arrests of foreign journalists, including Americans Danny Fenster and Nathan Mong, highlight the urgency of cutting off this brutal regime's financial flows. Can you tell us what steps are being taken by the U.S. government to secure the release of Danny Fenster and Nathan Mong?
Yeah, we're very concerned with their detentions. Journalists doing their jobs, Americans. We've had actually consular access to Nathan Mong. We have not had that access to Daniel Fenster, which in and of itself is a violation of the Vienna Convention, among other things. So we are pressing in every way that we can, not only to get the access in the first instance, but to get them released and get them home. It's challenging because, of course, our contacts and ability to engage the military regime are extremely limited, but we're working this through other countries, other partners as well.
Okay, so whether it's journalism being practiced in the United States or in Saudi Arabia or in Burma, I think it's absolutely imperative that the United States government stand up to make sure that their names are known and that they know that they are going to have the United States government on their side. So the more that can be done, I think the better for every journalist in the world sending that signal. In March, I called for the United States to take steps to sanction the Myanmar oil and gas enterprise, whose revenues are an estimated $1.5 billion annually and make up one of the largest remaining streams funding the junta. Will the United States take steps to cut off the flow of oil and gas revenues to the military junta? Some companies have suspended payments, but there is still no comprehensive regime in place to ensure these funds don't continue to support the military.
Yeah, we're looking at the most effective means we can bring to bear to deny support to the regime. That includes, by the way, engaging other countries that have investments in enterprises that support the regime to consider ending those investments and that support. But we will look at anything that can meaningfully do that. We also have to factor in the impact that any step would take on the people of Burma to make sure that we're not doing harm to them in the process.
Yeah, please. And I think it is important for us not to do harm, but I've had extensive conversations with the Burmese activists, members of the National Unity Government, and NGOs who argue strongly that we can cut off this funding to the military without major negative impacts to the people of Burma, who are already suffering so much. And I just urge you to use all the tools you have to cut off that funding. And oil revenues, unfortunately, in too many countries in the world, is the stream that goes to the plutocrats, the autocrats that run these countries. And the more that we deal with the oil and gas issue in all these countries, I think the better off we are. And I want to applaud you for prioritizing LGBTQI rights in the first 100 days. As we celebrate Pride Month, all around the world, the Pride flag hangs across U.S. embassies, sending a message of tolerance and love. Back here in January, you said that you were going to swiftly appoint an LGBTQI envoy. Could you give us the update on what the status of that process is?
Best update is to say stay tuned. We're actively working on that. We've got to, as you know, run through a lot of traps when it comes to making vetting, et cetera, but we are actively working on that, and I hope to have a name for you in the near future.
Okay, and if I may, in terms of international law, it is legal for asylum seekers to present themselves at the United States border for processing. Could you clarify what the administration's position is on that? Because the number of refugees and asylum seekers who need help is larger than ever, and it will probably increase. So what is that message to those who are seeking asylum in our country in terms of presenting themselves at our border?
You're correct, but I don't want to get out of my lane and want to make sure I'm deferring to my colleagues who are responsible for these issues, starting with the Department of Homeland Security and the Secretary there. But as a basic proposition, and our entire practice and history up until recently had been that, yes, people have the right to present themselves for asylum and to have that request considered and acted on. I think one of the very significant challenges that we faced over the years is that we've not had the resources in place to deal with that effectively and efficiently. As a result, people presenting themselves for asylum would not have their case evaluated and adjudicated in a short period of time, and that led to a series of other problems and concerns. So one of the things I think that would need to be done in order to make good on the long tradition of having people present themselves for asylum is to make sure that there are actually resources in place to do that. For example, judges or others who are able to quickly assess and evaluate whether there's a legitimate claim, because if there's not, people need to return. Now, as a practical matter right now, the border is not open. We also have Title 42 that's in effect as a result of COVID. But in the future, we need to reform the system for asylum.
Yeah, we don't want to change our policy on asylum. We want to make sure the funding is there, so that those who do present themselves are given the protections of American law. But can't thank you enough, Mr. Secretary, for the great job you're doing. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator.
Senator Young.
Welcome,
Good to see you,
Secretary. Mr. Secretary, where a department decides to allocate its resources, suggests what its priorities are. And we see this clearly in the State Department's allocation of foreign military financing. The department requests $6.1 billion in FMF for the upcoming year, of which a mere $129 million is allocated for partners in East Asia and the Pacific at a time of increasing Chinese military aggressions across the region. The China legislation that this chamber is currently considering on the floor of the U.S. Senate, and I hope passes today, includes a provision from this committee which would more than double the availability of FMF to the Indo-Pacific over the next 5 years, more than $650 million in total. What would be your priorities for directing these funds, the $650 million? And then relatedly, more broadly, maybe you could speak to the State Department's priorities for increasing conventional military assistance, that is, foreign military funding as well as training.
Thank you very much. And let me just say, we welcome working with you on that going forward to make sure that we are directing and dedicating our resources in the most important places and as effectively as possible. I think we have to look at this in a couple of ways. One, in some instances, particularly in the Asia Pacific, we benefit from already extremely capable allies and partners, including allies and partners that have the means to further make the necessary investments in their defense and in our collective security. So that's an important factor. And of course, as you know, with both Japan and Korea, we've been working very hard to extend the host nation support agreements that we have, as well as make available technology to them and to other partners. Similarly, we have a long track record of doing that with Australia. But having said that, I'd actually welcome an opportunity to think with you about how we can most effectively direct that kind of assistance and support.
I appreciate that. I'll follow up with you and your team in that regard. Earlier this year, Mr. Secretary, the previous commander of INDOPACOM, the U.S. Indo-Pacific Command, called for consistent arms sales to Taiwan and for the United States to help to encourage Taiwan on their investments, including investments which are critical to deterring China. What capabilities, Mr. Secretary, are the most important for Taiwan to possess?
I think there are a few things. First, and to your point, I think we've had about $18 billion in foreign military sales since 2017. So there's a strong foundation, and indeed, a number of sales have gone forward just in the last weeks and months. One of the things I think we should focus on is helping Taiwan strengthen its asymmetric capabilities, like reserve force reform. There is, some focus that countries often have on these large weapon systems. That can be important in defense, but the strategies, the asymmetric capabilities, these are, I think, increasingly important.
How can we build and support a robust foreign military financing agreement with Taiwan so that we might give them greater flexibility in increasing their conventional capabilities?
I'd certainly be interested in hearing where there are problems, constraints, challenges, and looking to see if there's more we can do and more effectively consistent with the Taiwan Relations Act and our commitment to make sure that Taiwan has the means to defend itself.
I think we're going to have to make some difficult decisions there moving forward. I'll look forward to working with you. Related to difficult decisions and problem sets, let's pivot to Iran. I continue to be, I know so many of my colleagues are deeply concerned by the administration's, it seems, hurry to reach a nuclear agreement with Iran, even as the regime provides material support to groups that just spent 2 weeks raining rockets into our ally Israel. I hope you can appreciate the tension that some see or feel there. Why does the department believe that relaxing sanctions and providing more resources for Iran to fund their proxy network would improve the security of the region?
Senator, I think what would improve the security of the region would be to start with making sure that Iran cannot continue to gallop forward with its nuclear program, which unfortunately it's doing since we pulled out of the agreement and it decided as a result not to abide by the constraints. And as we were discussing a little bit earlier with our colleagues, what we've seen Iran do under maximum pressure is to significantly increase its capacity when it comes to its stockpile of enriched uranium, more than tenfold what it had during the agreement. When it comes to spinning more advanced centrifuges, enriching to 20%, in some small cases to 60%. All of this means that Iran is now moving inexorably to a place where the breakout time for it to produce fissile material for a weapon will move from a year or more under the agreement to now probably a few months, and if this keeps going, to a matter of weeks. And as we were discussing earlier, that means that Iran is going to act with even greater impunity in all these other areas where we all agree we need to stop what it's doing. Beyond that, I'd say that unfortunately, Iran's support for terrorism, for groups like Hamas, destabilizing actions in the region, that was happening before the JCPOA. It was happening during the JCPOA. It's accelerated since we pulled out of the JCPOA, and Iran has lifted not only constraints on the nuclear side, but apparently constraints on its actions in other areas.
I'll just end with a couple of sentences with the chairman's indulgence here because my time is, I'm over my allotted time. I'll just indicate it remains unclear to me how the administration intends to reach a longer and stronger nuclear deal. If you spoke to that today, I'm unclear how you get there. I know the president campaigned on that, but unclear how we get there. And I would also indicate that if any deal is struck between the administration and our negotiators and the Iranians, that needs, Senator Johnson has indicated, that needs to be submitted to this body as a treaty so that we can give sanction to it and so that it might be more enduring as we look into the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator.
Thank you. Senator Merkley.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Secretary. The previous administration in the State Department, Secretary Pompeo, found that China was engaged in genocide in its treatment of the Uyghur community. And under your leadership, I believe the State Department has reaffirmed that China is engaged in genocide.
That's correct.
So right now we have a bill on the floor, the competition bill with China. And so lots of Chinese issues are getting attention, including this. The sanctions that are in Senator Rubio's and mine, Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, are in the underlying bill. And also attention to the fact that China is hosting the 2022 Olympic Games while engaged in genocide. The underlying bill has Senator Romney's amendment from committee. I think it had substantial bipartisan support, a sense of Congress that that diplomats should not attend. And so I just wanted to ask you today, do you support diplomats from the United States not attending the 2022 Olympics while China is engaged in genocide?
Senator, what we're doing is right now is consulting closely with allies and partners to define the common concerns that we have about China, and ideally to establish a shared approach, which I think would be much more effective than everyone going off in their own direction. So we're in the process of those consultations, and I'd be happy to share more as we move forward.
Thank you. As you engage in those shared approaches, I just want to remind you, which I don't need to do because I know you know this, that this has echoes of 1936, when Hitler and the Nazi regime hosted the Olympics in Germany while they were already engaged in egregious, brutal treatment of Jewish Germans and other political opponents within Germany. And that was considered a massive propaganda victory for Hitler and distracted attention from that brutal treatment. And that's the point about a diplomatic boycott. And I think even if our allies don't end up agreeing, I think the U.S. should take that stand. And I think the majority of the members of this committee, maybe it was universal in adopting Senator Romney's amendment. So I just want to encourage you to ponder that frame in this conversation with our allies. And I think it's an important frame also for our stand on human rights more broadly in advocacy around the planet.
On another China topic, they are financing some 200 to 240 coal projects around the world. At the same time that we're already in deep trouble. I was struck by the map that came out in the New York Times 2 weeks ago that showed the last 30 years compared to the previous 30 years. So 1990 through 2020 compared to 1960, 1990 in terms of both the temperature patterns average and the drought patterns. And it was dramatic change between those two periods. We're already approaching 1 to 1.5 degrees centigrade across parts of the United States. So I was concerned when the administration greenlighted the Willow project. That's 160,000 estimated barrels per day, producing as early as 2024 on the North Slope for an estimated 30 years. So a massive extraction. I was concerned in part because when you extract that oil, it gets burned somewhere and it has a massive acceleration of the impacts. A big irony is they're having to freeze the permafrost, which I guess we'll have to stop calling permafrost, in order to support the equipment to extract the oil, which will accelerate the melting. But I was also concerned on the diplomatic front that if we engage in this type of extraction, new projects, and by the way, the pipelines that are being greenlighted through this, hundreds of miles of pipeline, are considered to be essentially the pathway for other projects that will follow the Willow project. If we do that, how do we have the standing in the world to talk about Canadian tar sands, to talk about Chinese coal plants, and to lead this world in the biggest challenge humanity has faced, which is a fast pivot off fossil fuels?
Senator, I very much agree with the general proposition that leading by the power of our example is important. And when it comes to climate, I can't comment on domestic internal issues. It's not my brief. But let me say this: I think that we have made very significant commitments when it comes to curbing emissions going forward, and that in turn has helped us leverage much more meaningful commitments from other countries, which are absolutely essential if we're going to solve this problem. As you know better than I do, we're 15% of global emissions. Even if we do everything right at home, we have to bring the other 85% along. Plus, we should not be the only ones tackling this problem. So what I've seen, at least internationally so far, this is all I can attest to, is that rejoining Paris, the summit convened by President Biden of world leaders just a couple of months ago, and the raised ambitions of our own efforts have had a meaningful impact in bringing others to raise their ambitions and to do more. And that's at least what I'm seeing so far.
Well, I do think it's been a lot of actions of the administration that have been very helpful in that regard. But I also feel this decision and the Nord Stream 2 decision, both involving more fossil fuel infrastructure, more extraction, slow down the pivot that is essential. And I don't think the humanity addresses this challenge without really fierce, determined American leadership. And my final question, I condemn Hamas's use of the rockets against Israel. But I am also concerned about Israel undermining the possibility for peace by continuously establishing new settlements, expanding those settlements, and establishing roadways that split the West Bank into a number of smaller units that make a potential economy in a two-state solution extremely difficult. Is this a concern that you share, and did you raise this concern in your meeting with Benny Gantz last week?
Yes and yes.
Thank you.
Thank you. Senator Barrasso.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, welcome back. I'd like to follow up on some things that I asked of you during the confirmation process. And the first is Nord Stream 2, the pipeline. There is strong bipartisan opposition on this committee and throughout the entire Senate to President Biden's deliberate failure to sanction all of the entities that are involved in the construction of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. Protecting this Russian trap is not in the U.S. national security interest. It is a grave mistake.
The pipeline threatens the energy security of our friends as well as our allies. We know that Russia uses energy as a geopolitical weapon to coerce, to manipulate. I know you've agreed to that during our confirmation hearing. And it does seem that President Biden is now allowing the Nord Stream 2 pipeline to be added to Russia's energy arsenal. So Putin has said essentially the same thing. On Friday, he stated that Ukraine must now show goodwill if it wants Russian gas transiting through the country to continue. He said that Russia is going to further threaten to cut gas to Ukraine. They've done that over the Donbass conflict. This is even before Nord Stream 2 has been completed. So I think it's really critical that we act now. I think we have a misguided policy right now coming from your boss, the president. I think it's in our national security to impose sanctions on Nord Stream 2 now. Why is it not in our national security to impose those sanctions?
If the sanctions could, in our judgment, have been effective in actually stopping the physical completion of the pipeline, that would have been one thing. In our judgment, they would not have had that effect. We did, as you know, on May 19th, sanction more entities than have ever been sanctioned under the PISA legislation. But as you know as well, the pipeline construction began in 2018. By the time we took office, it was more than 90% complete. And as we looked at this, it became clear to us that the actual joining of those last pipes was not going to be stopped by sanctioning the overall entity Nord Stream 2 AG or the CEO. Having said that, two things are very important. One, the waiver that we issued can be rescinded at any time. Second, what has to happen, there are two things that have to happen, and they are, I think, happening. Germany is coming to the table to talk about steps that would need to be taken if anything starts to flow through this pipeline to make sure that any damage done to Ukraine, in fact, is not done, is undone. And that, as we discussed a little bit earlier, involves several things. It involves making sure that Ukraine is whole when it comes to any transit fees that it might lose as a result of the pipeline actually going into operation. Second, ensuring that gas or oil, for that matter, can't be used as a weapon of coercion, blackmail by Russia, and there are means to do that. Third, to make sure that countries are acting up front when Russia acts out to respond. I'd also point out that when it comes to the operation of the pipeline, there are very significant remaining factors that have to be taken into account. Insurance, permitting. We're looking very hard at those entities as well. So we need to see going forward what we can put in place to prevent, mitigate, undo any damage that would be done if the pipeline actually begins operations. But as a very practical matter, when it came to the last few meters of this pipeline, it was our judgment that sanctioning that entity would not have had any effect. And the worst of all worlds would be a combination of pipeline physically completed, relationship with Germany poisoned, and no incentive for Germany to actually come to the table to engage in trying to mitigate the damage that could be done by the pipeline actually operating.
Yeah, I would just point out, Mr. Secretary, that during your confirmation process, because you just talked about the last few meters, you reiterated your opposition to the Nord Stream 2, and you said, quote, "I am determined to do whatever we can to prevent that completion the last 100 yards." So the fact that it was 90% complete when you came into office and the administration came into office, your commitment to us was the last 100 yards. I want to move on to the World Health Organization. While President Biden and the administration vowed to reform the World Health Organization, I think it threw away its leverage early on by rejoining the World Health Organization and giving it more than $200 million. The administration could have insisted that reforms be made. The annual World Health Assembly meeting, May 24th, was another opportunity to demand action, yet it just reinforced the systemic problems and the inability of this organization to make real reforms. For example, China succeeded at that meeting in blocking Taiwan's participation at the World Health Assembly. Look, Taiwan only wanted to be an observer, and arguably Taiwan has one of the world's best records in combating COVID-19. In May, you stated there is no reasonable justification for Taiwan's continued exclusion. We agree, from the forum. In addition, the World Health Assembly voted to place Syria and Belarus in leadership positions at the World Health Organization. You claim the best way to reform the World Health Organization is from within. No reforms are being made. How will we be able to make any meaningful reforms at the World Health Organization if we can't even prevent dictators like Assad, and who slaughters people for his own people, from having a leadership role in what is the World Health Organization?
We've only just gotten re-engaged with the World Health Organization. Unfortunately, this is not like flipping a switch. There is, you're right, work to be done, work that we are doing to push that body, that institution, to make the necessary reforms. And we are very, very intent on that. I think you saw with the initial Phase 1 report that was done on the COVID origins, the initial impulse might have been to say, work done, job complete, but a number of us made very clear the absolute not only inadequacy of that report, but the fact that its methodology and the engagement by China in writing the report was totally insufficient and undermined its credibility. And now the head of the World Health Organization has basically agreed with that, and they're pursuing the phase 2, which is vitally important to try to get to the bottom of what happened.
Let me just conclude. May 12th, we had a committee hearing, bipartisan committee, titled COVID-19 Pandemic and International Response. Gail Smith, who is the State Department Coordinator for Global COVID Response and Health Security, was here. I specifically urged her to use the World Health Assembly annual meeting to push for reforms and get them implemented. It certainly did not occur, and I think it's fair to say that the actions were unsuccessful.
We are working on pushing the organization to reform. As I said, it's not like flipping a switch, but we are very much focused on doing that, and we'll come back to you as this moves along to see if we succeed in moving in the right direction.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator.
Senator Schatz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Secretary, for being here. I want to talk to you about climate. I know what you're doing in the big picture. I want to talk to you about climate within the department, with the Foreign Service officers and throughout. I worry a bit that climate policy swings back and forth depending on who's president, and to the extent that it's possible, I think it's really important for the Department of State in particular to kind of embed in its work, in its training, in its day-to-day operations, in your bilateral conversations, not just at the secretary level, but at the sort of line level, conversations about collaboration on climate action, which is to say transitioning to a clean energy economy, but also climate mitigation strategies, which in the short run I think are our best platform for sort of bilateral goodwill building, particularly in Oceania and other places that are immediately facing those impacts. So can you talk to me a little bit about what the department itself is doing, not at the sort of foreign policy level, but at the line level?
Yeah, sure. A few things. First, we have two things at the department right now. Of course, we have the work that the former Secretary Kerry is doing as our special envoy on climate diplomacy around the world. But we also have, critically, a very important bureau that I hope will the Bureau of Oceans and the Environment, that will hopefully soon get confirmed by the Senate new leadership. That's going to be very important. But in our budget request, both in terms of the resources and in terms of the human resources, we know that we need to build up our capacity, our expertise in a number of areas, and climate is one of those. And the request reflects the desire to do that. And so I'm hopeful that we get some of these resources to bring in more expertise to sharpen our training, to bring to bear technology so that we can advance the climate mission more effectively.
You're looking at some changes in the curriculum for Foreign Service officers? Okay, good. Let me talk to you about Oceania. I really appreciate the fact that you gave a message to the Pacific Island Conference of Leaders last week, and I know how meaningful it is to have the Secretary of State talk directly with leaders from Oceania and commit U.S. leadership to confront the climate crisis and support vaccine deployment. I introduced a bipartisan bill with Senator Murkowski to elevate all of Oceania in U.S. foreign policy, and the chairman and ranking member included a number of these provisions in the bill that we're hopefully adopting today on the Senate floor. Can you just talk to me about why it's important that the United States step up its engagement with all of Oceania and make it a central part of our Indo-Pacific strategy?
Well, I think, among other things, it's one area where we see China very actively engaged, and on a whole variety of levels, whether it's strategic, whether it's economic, whether it's environmental. We want to make sure that we, in fact, are effectively engaged and certainly not ceding the terrain. We also have, as you know very well, in a number of these countries, territories, very significant climate challenges that they are going to be on the front lines of having to deal with, and we want to make sure that we can be effective in helping them deal with it. So there are a host of reasons, why I think it makes sense to try to not only sustain but increase our engagement. It's also one of the reasons I wanted to make sure early on that I had an opportunity to engage with these countries.
Thank you. I want to talk a little bit about the South and East China Sea. You know, everybody knows we're doing freedom of navigation operations to keep sea lanes and shipping lanes open. Everybody understands what China is doing, which is sort of using these so-called fishing fleets as proxies for the Chinese government. I worry a little bit about their ability to control escalation, because they're using these proxies, and right now we have a rather binary choice between doing nothing and mobilizing the United States Navy. Now, if it gets kinetic, we win the engagement, but in a lot of ways, everybody loses that engagement. And so I'm wondering about the use of the United States Coast Guard or other partners, whether we can start to work in an intermediate space to be present in the East and South China Sea without mobilizing the entire United States Navy, which seems to me to be a little bit of a mismatch in raw power.
Well, a few things. First, with regard to the Navy, it is important to note that over the last years, starting back in 2010, 2011, we shifted our resource deployment so that 60% of the Navy would be in the Asia Pacific. Again, a process that began back in 2010. And that's significant because it is important, obviously, to have the deterrent capacity. It's important to have the capacity to engage in freedom of navigation operations, et cetera. So that's a foundational baseline. Having said that, I think there are a few things that are also very important. We've worked very hard just in the last few months with Australia, with France, with Germany, with Indonesia, with Japan, with Malaysia, with the Philippines, the UK, Vietnam, that is, concerned countries in the region as well as concerned countries outside of it, to join in speaking forcefully and engaging directly when we see China trying to abuse its actions in whether it's unlawful claims that it's making, the militarization of disputed features, provocations, including with its maritime militia. So we have a growing group of countries coming together that are focused on this. In addition, we have made very clear and reasserted our own defense commitments to countries, for example, the Senkakus in Japan. We have an agreement, as you know, with the Philippines. We have reaffirmed and reasserted those. We're certainly looking at other means that can help deal with some of the challenges. We talked a little bit earlier as well, my own view, and this is not an administration position because it's not something that's come up with the president yet, but my own view is that we'd also very much benefit from ratifying the law of the sea.
That was my final question, so thank you. You said that this morning. I appreciate that you think it would be useful to the United States to ratify the Law of the Sea Treaty. And I understand you haven't talked to the President of the United States about this yet. Can you please talk to the President of the United States and get back to the committee?
No, absolutely. And I'd say also that when he was chairman of this committee and or ranking member, that was something that he supported. In fact, we held hearings back then. But I think what's particularly significant is that the people who feel strongest about this in our government are our colleagues who happen to wear uniforms.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. I sat through several Law of the Sea hearings that I was asked to chair. And I have to be honest with you, unless we get over the ideological problems that some people have about entering into these agreements, we spent an enormous amount of time. I think it's incredibly important for a whole host of both security and economic reasons, but we got to get some people to start rethinking what it is to engage in some of these treaties. Senator Cruz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, welcome. Thank you for being here. Not since the Jimmy Carter administration has an administration had as many serious foreign policy blunders in such a short period of time. The Biden administration came in the first week in office, ended the Remain in Mexico policy, which has prompted the worst illegal immigration crisis in 20 years. In the Middle East, the Biden administration inherited a flowering of peace with the historic Abraham Accords. And the Biden administration came in and began undermining our friend and ally, the State of Israel, sent over $250 million to the Palestinian Authority, which is in bed with Hamas, which announced even this week that they are continuing to fund the families of terrorists who murder innocent civilians, and they're now doing so in effect because money is fungible with U.S. taxpayer dollars. And as a result of those foreign policy blunders, what had been historic peace became war in recent weeks in the Middle East. But I think there's no area in which the foreign policy blunders have been greater than concerning Russia and Nord Stream 2. You are not surprised that I am making this point to you today. I think it is useful to pause for a moment and reflect on the successes we had as a nation concerning Russia and Nord Stream 2 and just how President Biden has given those away. In the summer and fall of 2019, I introduced in this committee bipartisan sanctions to stop the construction of Nord Stream 2, the natural gas pipeline from Russia to Germany. I did so along with Senator Shaheen. It was overwhelmingly bipartisan. Indeed, every Democrat on this committee supported it, and all but one Republican on this committee supported it. At the time, there was considerable Russian disinformation being pushed in Europe. The Russian disinformation said the pipeline is nearly complete. As they said later that year, the pipeline is 90% complete. You cannot stop it. The sanctions cannot work. The Russians pushed that relentlessly. We now know that disinformation was a lie. The Congress passed that bipartisan legislation into law. It was signed into law, if my memory serves me correctly, at 7 p.m. on a Thursday. At 6:45 p.m., 15 minutes before the president signed those bipartisan sanctions into law, the company building the pipeline announced they were immediately halting construction. So the Russian disinformation was exactly that. It was a lie, and the sanctions worked. From that moment, for the next year, the pipeline lay dormant and fallow, and there was no construction. The next year, in December of 2020, I introduced, along with Senator Shaheen, a second wave of bipartisan sanctions that passed into law, ratcheting up the punishment even more. And then, unfortunately, the Biden administration came in and turned this incredible bipartisan victory for America into a colossal failure. It started in November, shortly after the election in 2020, when an individual, Nicholas Burns, who was identified as an advisor to then President-elect Biden, told a German newspaper that, quote, the Americans must suspend sanctions in return for a temporary halt to Nord Stream 2.
Now, that message from the incoming Biden team was heard loud and clear, which is why the Moscow Times quoted the German foreign minister as saying, "Of course, we are very interested in discussing the Nord Stream 2 topic with the new administration in Washington." That initial sign of weakness was heard, and in late December, the Russians resumed construction. For a year it had been dormant. Late December, they resumed construction in German waters. But it wasn't yet done. The second wave of sanctions that we passed into law still gave them pause. They threatened to resume construction in deep-sea Danish waters on January 15th. But they didn't dare. They didn't dare because they believed the outgoing Trump administration would impose sanctions. And they recommenced construction of the pipeline in Danish waters on January 24th, 5 days after President Biden was sworn into office. They did so because they were convinced that the Biden administration would not enforce the sanctions. You sat before this committee and promised you would use every tool you have to stop the pipeline. You sat in my office and promised, you and I discussed this at great length in my office, you promised you would use every tool you have to stop the pipeline. You put out a public statement in March that explicitly warned, quote, "Any entity involved in the Nord Stream 2 pipeline risks U.S. sanctions and should immediately abandon work on the pipeline." But then, unfortunately, the Biden administration decided to waive those sanctions for Nord Stream 2 AG, the umbrella group building the pipeline, and for its CEO. In doing so, the Biden administration all but ensured this pipeline will be completed, because I assume you have made a decision to embrace Angela Merkel, and in doing so, to allow this pipeline to be completed even though it puts billions of dollars in the pockets of Vladimir Putin. It weakens Europe, it makes Europe more dependent on Russia for energy, and it hurts American jobs. Why did Joe Biden decide to waive the bipartisan sanctions and give what is in effect a multi-billion-dollar gift to Vladimir Putin?
Senator, it won't surprise you to know that I disagree with your assessment across the board, but just to focus on the pipeline. I think we're also apparently not working from the same fact set, because under your chronology, miraculously, the construction of the pipeline had been not only halted, but could not have been very far along, and then somehow suddenly...
With respect, it was 90% complete in 2019 when the sanctions went into effect. So the statement you made earlier that it was 90% complete, there was nothing you can do, that was true a year ago, and the sanctions worked.
Well, it was 90% more than 90% complete based on the information we had when we came to office.
That was true a year ago when the sanctions were passed.
And what we saw and what we've seen is the companies finding workarounds, finding alternatives. As one company would drop out, another would drop in. The Russians were able to bring to bear.
Prior to the Biden team suggesting sanctions wouldn't be imposed, had they returned to building the pipeline?
We didn't suggest that sanctions wouldn't be imposed. I think
was the quote from Nicholas Burns not accurate?
Mr. Burns was not a member of the administration. There was no administration at that point. But beyond that, had the
so you
Germans,
say it's purely coincidence that it began on January 24th?
Had the Germans agreed
the Secretary will suspend.
Yeah.
The Senator has used all 7 of his minutes before he asked his question. I've allowed you 2 interruptions. We're going to let the Secretary finish, and then I need to go to another member who's been waiting for some time.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Senator, had the idea, for example, of suspension for suspension, that is, the Germans and others suspend all work on the pipeline in turn for suspension of sanctions, that would have been, I think, a positive outcome. And that would have given us time to work to make sure that the pipeline could not be completed. But it was our judgment, based on the facts that we had available to us, including from the intelligence community, that the construction was going to be completed, the physical construction, regardless of any step that we took in the last few months. As you know, we did sanction more entities under PISA in this last round, May 19th, than had ever been sanctioned before. But we also need to preserve the ability to insist that Germany work with us if the pipeline is actually going to become operational. Distinction between the physical completion of the pipeline and it becoming operational to mitigate, counter, undo the damage that we agree would be done potentially to Ukraine, potentially to others. And that's what the Germans are now doing. I think the worst possible outcome from our perspective would be physical completion of the pipeline, sanctions that didn't stop it, poisoned relationship with Germany, and no incentive on Germany's part to actually work to undo or mitigate the damage that will be done to Ukraine. So that's what we're working on now. As I mentioned, perhaps before you came in, we do still also have some things that we're looking hard at because, as you know very well, since you know this so well, there are permitting requirements, even with the physical completion of the pipeline before it becomes operational. There are insurance requirements, and we're looking very hard at any entities that might be engaged in those efforts. But at the same time, we need to make sure that if this does become operational at some point, that Ukraine is protected, others are protected. There are ways that we're able to do that, making sure that it's made whole on any lost transit fees, making sure that gas cannot be used as a tool of blackmail or coercion, and so having a reserve that can come to its assistance if Russia tried to do that. Other steps to automatically come back at Russia if it misbehaves. So we're putting all of that in place, and I just want to come back to another proposition that is important. The waiver can be rescinded at any time.
Thank you. Senator Van Hollen is recognized, and I'm going to ask him to preside as I go vote. There's also still pending, finally, Senator Booker and Senator Murphy, and then we'll be finished.
Mr. Secretary, it's good to see you again.
Thank you.
As I mentioned at this morning's Appropriations Committee hearing, I support the overall contours of the budget that you and the President have submitted. We need a strong Department of State. We need a strong Foreign Service to meet the challenges we face around the world. And the budget you proposed contains the resources to recruit, train, retain a first-rate, diverse workforce. I think you'd also agree that one of the key tools in both in recruitment and retention is how we treat our Foreign Service families serving overseas. 4 years ago, Senator Sullivan and I founded the bipartisan Foreign Service Caucus here on the Hill, and based on our conversations with the American Foreign Service Association and others, we introduced legislation called the Foreign Service Families Act. It's a piece of legislation before this committee right now, and it essentially provides Foreign Service families serving overseas the same kind of sort of amenities and benefits that many military families serving overseas have. I mentioned this to you in a phone call about 10 days ago. I'm hoping that you can tell the committee today that you've had a chance to review the legislation and that it is supported by the Biden administration.
I strongly support the objectives and the goals of this and want to come back and talk to you about it. Mea culpa, since we spoke, I have not had the opportunity to focus on it directly, although I asked my team to do so. But I think with the press of some events in the last few days, I haven't had a chance to catch up with them. So if it's all right, let me come back to you on that. But certainly, as described, and in terms of the objectives, I couldn't agree more. And by the way, now that I've had an opportunity to travel a little bit on the job, every place I go, I spend time with our embassy and the embassy community, and I share your high regard and determination to support the families of the men and women who are part of our Foreign Service, because, as we both know, they're serving too, but they don't get the same support necessarily that those who are actually direct employees of the government do.
I appreciate that, Mr. Secretary. If your team could just get back to us as soon as possible. I've talked to the chairman about this legislation. I think we would like to move it, but obviously we would like input from the Secretary of State. Just to flag another topic, today Senator Toomey and I sent a letter to Secretary Yellen applauding the administration for the sanctions it placed on 24 officials in China who had been complicit in the crackdown on Hong Kong, actions taken under the Hong Kong Accountability Act. We noted in that letter, though, that the law, which passed unanimously last year, requires that sanctions also be placed on any banks that facilitate those individuals. And we've asked the Secretary of Treasury to report to us. Obviously, these are the kind of decisions that involve the Secretary of State and Secretary of Treasury. I want to put that on your radar screen because we are going to be pushing to make sure that we fully implement that law. Let me turn to Afghanistan, something you and I have talked about as well in the past, and I appreciate your support to expedite the visas for Afghan interpreters or Afghan staff. I've worked most closely with U.S. forces and may therefore be targeted for assassination. That, of course, underscores the fragility of the situation as the United States withdraws its forces and the risks. We all recognize that a negotiated political solution is the only way forward in Afghanistan. We got to bring all the parties together, including the Taliban. And I commend Ambassador Khalilzad for the good work he's done. My view is we need to strengthen his hand. We need to show all the parties involved that there is a real peace dividend if they go in that direction. And so we've proposed, again, bipartisan legislation to create reconstruction opportunity zones. These are zones within Afghanistan and certain parts of Pakistan, the parts of Pakistan that were really controlled by the Pakistani Taliban years ago, that would allow the duty-free export from those regions to the United States for certain kinds of goods. It gives the president a lot of flexibility to shape the legislation. When I asked Ambassador Khalilzad about it, he said he thought this was a very, very worthwhile concept. He wanted to work on the details. I've mentioned this to you. I believe time is of the essence. I think we all remember what happened when the Soviets withdrew from Afghanistan way back in the day. The United States had, of course, supported the Mujahideen. We disengaged. We know the sad end of that story. My view is we have to remain very engaged, and that means not just supporting the Afghan military, but making sure people have the tools to try to build a better future. And this has been a proposal that's actually been supported by Democrat and Republican administrations in the past. It passed the House of Representatives overwhelmingly years and years ago. It floundered in the Senate for a variety of reasons. I think the time is now to get it done. And I don't know if you've had a chance since we spoke to take a look at it, but we really need the administration to support this idea in the interests of providing stability and more opportunities as the United States withdraws its forces.
Yeah. Senator, I was seized with this idea after we spoke. And like Ambassador Khalilzad, I think conceptually it's a very good idea. And again, I asked my team not only to look at it themselves, but also to talk to other colleagues, other agencies that would have equities in this. And so there again, I need to come back to you. But I think, to your point, making it clear that there are real upsides, real opportunity to peace and to anyone who actually plays into that, as opposed to doing things that perpetuate war, is fundamental. And I think with regard to Pakistan, for example, they say they're focused on so-called geoeconomics, which is good. But I think we need to demonstrate that that can have some real meaning, and they would then factor that into their thinking about the steps they're willing to take to make sure that Afghanistan doesn't descend into civil war. So it's a long way of saying, I really will come back to you on this, because I think as an idea, as a concept, it's a very good one. We of course have to look at the details. I need to talk to colleagues in the other departments who have equities in this.
I appreciate that, Mr. Secretary. I do think time is of the essence here, given the schedule, and this is, in my view, an issue that requires a foreign policy, national security lens. That's the whole purpose of this action. It's a very limited approach, creating ROZs. So I hope that you will take the laboring oar in this effort. Thank you for your answer and your service. And with that, let me recognize Senator Murphy.
Thank you, Senator Van Hollen. I know this has been a very long day. This is the second committee that Senator Van Hollen and I have had the chance to talk to you in, and I know you're at the end, so I'll be very brief.
What are you doing tomorrow?
We can be right here. That we've only covered about 1/5 of the world. Listen, I wanted to just come back to the Iran nuclear deal for a moment. I think you answered this question in part in response to some comments from the chair and the ranking member. But in assessing the efficacy of the maximum pressure campaign, I think we have to have a reckoning with what we got. The Trump administration put on the table 12 demands. From what I can tell, none of them were met. The country that I pay the closest attention to, Yemen, saw an increased amount of activity from Iran with respect to their proxy forces there. Our forces in Iraq started getting shot at again by Iran's proxies there. I guess I sort of come to the conclusion, as we're sort of weighing whether to continue forward with the Trump-era sanctions or waive or release them in exchange for a new commitment from Iran on its nuclear program, I think it's important for us to ask what we got for those sanctions. And in fact, isn't there evidence that Iran's behavior in many respects got worse, not better, during that time? Am I wrong about my assessment here? They broke out of the nuclear program. They started shooting at our troops again in Iraq. They upped their support for many of their proxies in the region, and they refused to come back to the table. It doesn't seem like we got a lot for the sanctions that were reimposed and the new sanctions that were imposed during the Trump administration, which calls into question what we would get by keeping them in place for another 4 years.
Yeah, I share that assessment. I think that's right, and it's unfortunately borne out by the facts.
The second topic, and I'm surprised that Senator Portman didn't bring it up because he normally does. We were together as part of this delegation in Ukraine. He and I, as you know, have spent a lot of time working on standing up the capacity inside the State Department to combat misinformation. I know you've requested in your budget essentially flat funding for the Global Engagement Center. But my read is that there are more potential partners that the Global Engagement Center could work with around the world than there is funding. The Global Engagement Center is not really doing sort of direct counter-propaganda work. They're going out and making sure that independent journalists and truth tellers and folks who are rooting out propaganda have the support to do so. I know we're still looking for someone to head up that capacity at the State Department. What role do you envision GEC playing in our efforts to counteract Russian propaganda, but also non-state actor propaganda, Chinese propaganda around the world?
Senator, I think it's got a vital role to play, and one that we want to see strengthen even further. It's, as you know very well, engaged in campaigns to educate, to expose, to mitigate disinformation and misinformation. And it is already, as it stands, really the premier platform for information sharing. I think there are about 400 partners across 29 or so countries at this point that take advantage of it. It's worked very effectively, for example, to expose Russian websites that were removed from social media for propagating misinformation. disinformation from the PRC as well in third country elections. It exposed that and put a light on that. It's done very good, I think, open source mapping of some of the PRC's use of surveillance and data collection, for example, in Xinjiang. So we're seeing it effective across the board. I think that the request that we've made is appropriate and will enable it not only to sustain but to actually grow its mission. Having said that, I'd welcome working with you to make sure that it is properly resourced and operating as effectively as possible. And yes, we are working on bringing a new leader to the enterprise.
Well, I know your personal commitment to this mission. I thank you for it. And I'd also commend to both the committee and to you making sure that we have the right integration between the counter-propaganda mission at State through the GEC and the counter-propaganda mission at Department of Defense.
Yeah.
In the prior administration, I don't know that they were coordinating at the level that they could, something that we can do better on. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Secretary.
Thanks, Senator.
Thank you, Senator Murphy. We have now had 18 members of 22, so I think they've had great respect for your attendance, Mr. Secretary, and their interest. I just want to close on one or two comments. I know that Senator Kane's very good at making the case for the JCPOA. And it is true that Iran signed and said that it would never have a nuclear weapon. However, if you allow its ballistic missile program to move forward and it develops a delivery system for that nuclear material, and if you lift sanctions, and yes, they roll back for the moment, a year, 2 years, 3 years, but when they decide, if they decide to cross the threshold that they've violated their agreement, the time frame for them to develop the capacity for that nuclear weapon without any limitations on ballistic missiles and with their knowledge already as it relates to enrichment creates a difficult moment in which sanctions will have very little benefit at the end of the day. So I think that, to be intellectually honest, we have to recognize that part of it as well. I have two final questions. One is on Turkey. It's amazing to me that what was a NATO ally is a NATO ally, but who we had great aspirations for. There are more journalists and lawyers arrested in Turkey today and in jails. Turkey is constantly violating, from my perspective, international law when it seeks to threaten Cyprus and its international exclusive economic zone, when it declares an economic zone going to Libya that is not recognized at all but interferes with Greece's exclusive economic zone, when it engages in the aggression against Armenia through Azerbaijan, when it's playing a nefarious role in Libya. So what are we doing to counter Turkey's under Erdogan? And I say Turkey under Erdogan because it's not about the Turkish people, but it's certainly about its leader.
Yeah. We share those concerns, and we have engaged Turkey directly on them. And I can say with confidence that when President Biden sees President Erdogan in about a week's time, these will be front and center on the agenda. Look, I think our differences with Turkey, including the ones that you've cited just now, are no secret. And in many aspects, it is not acting as the NATO ally it should be, not the least of which with the acquisition of the S-400s from Russia. But beyond that, the actions that have been taken in the Eastern Mediterranean were deeply disturbing. I think we've been pleased to see it pull back from some of these efforts, including removing its ships from waters that Cyprus considers to be part of its exclusive economic zone and stopping the drilling action. So that's positive. But we have serious concerns as well with human rights, the treatment of journalists, which you were very right to put the spotlight on. So the president's going to have an opportunity to engage with President Erdogan directly on all of these issues. I will say that we also, I think, have an interest in trying to keep Turkey anchored to the West and aligned on some other critical issues. We do have important and overlapping interests in various ways in Syria when it comes to counterterrorism, in Afghanistan, dealing with some of Russia and Iran's malign influence. But we also have to confront directly these differences that you rightly spotlight.
Well, listen, I understand why we want it anchored in the West, but you can't be anchored in the West and drifting in every direction further away on all the core principles that we believe in as a NATO ally and also in all the other elements. Finally, I have to be honest with you, I was disappointed that the administration green-lighted the 907 waiver renewal despite Azerbaijan's attack on Nagorno-Karabakh. Now, after they got the 907 waiver, interfering with the actual territorial sovereignty of Armenia in the border issue, not releasing the political prisoners, not the political prisoners, the actual prisoners of the conflict in violation of international law. I mean, I think that they can act with impunity. And I think when we waived it, we gave them that green light.
Look, we'll have to continue taking a look at this. I was and have been working actively on this, particularly getting the return of the prisoners, getting engaged in an actual process, discussion, negotiation over an actual resolution, and working on those things. And it was my hope that we'd be able to get a little bit of traction there, but I think we'll have to continue to look at this and relook at this in the future.
Well, I hope you will. With the thanks of the committee for your service and for your tremendous appearance here today. I mean, you've gone through several hours here. Obviously, your knowledge, intellect, and scope is pretty extraordinary, so we're grateful to have your insights, grateful for your service. This committee's meeting will stay open until the close of business tomorrow. And again, with the thanks to the committee, this hearing is adjourned.